There is a city on the southern edge of Croatia, perched on a narrow shelf of limestone between the Adriatic Sea and the high, rocky walls of the Dinaric Alps, that should not exist, not in the way it exists, not for as long as it existed, not given everything the world threw at it across the span of 15 centuries. The walls that surround it are 45 meters wide in places and tower up to 25 meters above the sea. The stone is the color of old honey when the afternoon sun finds it, and when you walk the ramparts, you are walking on the same path that soldiers and merchants and senators and lovers walked for hundreds of years. The water below is a shade of blue that painters have argued over and photographers have failed to fully capture. The city inside those walls is tight and white and clean, its limestone streets polished smooth by 10 centuries of feet. Most people who see it today think of it as beautiful, and it is, but beauty was never the point. The point was survival. The point was that a small community of people, hemmed in by mountains on one side and open ocean on the other, with no army to speak of, no powerful patron to call upon, no natural resources beyond their own ingenuity, somehow navigated between the Ottoman Empire and the Venetian Republic and the Kingdom of Hungary and the Byzantine remnants and the ambitions of half a dozen other powers, and not only survived, but thrived, and built one of the most sophisticated republican governments the medieval world had ever seen, and abolished slavery 2 full centuries before England even began to have the conversation, and sent its merchant ships to every corner of the known world, and wrote poetry and staged plays, and endured earthquakes and plagues, and did all of this while remaining, stubbornly, impossibly, defiantly free. For over 4 centuries, the Republic of Ragusa maintained its independence, not through military might, but through something far more durable: intelligence, patience, and a complete and utter refusal to let ego get in the way of survival. Tonight, we are going to walk the full arc of this city's story, from the very first settlers who scratched a living from the limestone shelf, through the long Byzantine centuries, through the Venetian occupation and what followed it, through the golden age of trade when Ragusan merchants knew more about the courts of Istanbul and Madrid than the ambassadors who officially represented those places, through the earthquake that nearly ended everything in 1667, through the final decades when an aging republic tried to hold itself together against the tide of a changed world, and finally to Napoleon's soldiers arriving at the gates in 1808, and what that moment meant after everything the city had endured. This is not a story about warfare. There are battles in it, but they are not the point. This is a story about a different kind of power, the power of knowing when to fight and when to bow, the power of understanding that a small state's greatest weapon is not a sword, but a well-drafted letter, the power of a city that decided, very early, that freedom was worth more than pride, and then proved it for 500 years. And there is something else this story is about, something that only becomes visible when you look at the whole arc of it rather than any individual episode. It is about the relationship between intelligence and survival, not intelligence in the sense of armies or spies, though the city had both of those in their way. Intelligence in the deeper sense of the word, the capacity to understand your situation clearly, without illusion, without the wishful thinking that flatters your own importance, or the paranoia that distorts every threat into an existential crisis. The Ragusans were, for most of their history, genuinely clear-eyed about who they were and what they faced. That clarity was the foundation of everything else. Settle in, let the world outside grow quiet, and let us begin at the very beginning, in a time before there were walls, before there was a city, when there was only the limestone and the sea and the people who looked at both and decided this was where they would make their stand. Before we travel back to those first days on the limestone coast of the southern Adriatic, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here tonight. Whether you found this channel just recently or have been listening for months now, it means more than you know. These stories take a long time to find and longer still to tell properly, and knowing that someone on the other side is letting them carry them off to sleep is exactly the reason I keep making them. The history of Ragusa is one of the stories I've been turning over in my mind for a long time, and I hope that by the time you hear the last of it tonight, you will feel something of what I felt when I first understood what this small city had actually accomplished. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The coast of what we now call Croatia is one of the most geographically dramatic places in Europe. The Dinaric Alps do not gradually slope toward the sea the way most mountain ranges do. They fall. They fall steeply and suddenly, and in places they fall directly into the water, leaving barely enough flat ground for a narrow road between cliff and shore. The karst limestone that makes up this landscape is ancient and hard, and almost entirely without topsoil. Rain falls on it and disappears immediately into a network of underground channels, emerging somewhere else as springs or simply vanishing into the rock without a trace. Nothing grows easily here. The land does not give up its living without a fight, and the people who have made their homes in this landscape over the millennia have always had that quality in common with it. They do not give up easily either. The word karst itself, which geologists now use worldwide to describe this kind of limestone landscape, comes from the Slovenian and Croatian word for the rocky terrain that dominates this part of the Adriatic coast. It is a landscape of extremes. In summer, the sun beats down on white rock and the heat is fierce and dry. In winter, the Bora wind comes down from the mountains with a force that can knock a person sideways and drives the Adriatic into waves that roll in with the force of hammers. In spring, the brief season of rain turns the thin soil a vivid green and fills the air with the smell of wild herbs, sage and rosemary and thyme growing in the crevices where just enough earth has accumulated to support them. And always, in every season, there is the sea. The sea is the constant. The sea is what connects this rocky, isolated landscape to the wider world and what makes survival here and eventually prosperity possible. The Illyrians were the earliest inhabitants whose traces we can follow with any confidence. They were not one unified people, but a collection of tribes spread across the Western Balkans, stretching from the modern border of Italy in the north to what is now Albania in the south. They spoke related but distinct languages, and they organized themselves in ways that ranged from small farming communities to larger tribal confederacies, capable of fielding armies and contesting territory with their neighbors. They were a seafaring people when it suited them, launching raids along the Adriatic coast and occasionally further afield, and they were a warrior people when it did not suit them to be peaceful, which was reasonably often. Their hill forts, called gradine, dotted the limestone ridges above the coast. From these high points, which are sometimes still visible today as rings of tumbled stone on prominent hilltops, the Illyrians could see both the sea and the passes through the mountains behind them, giving them warning of threats from either direction. The choice of these high defensive positions over the more comfortable low ground tells you something important about the priorities of the people who built them. Security came before convenience. The ability to see what was coming and respond to it was worth the inconvenience of hauling water and food up steep slopes. The Greeks arrived on the Dalmatian coast in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, establishing trading colonies on the islands and at a few points on the mainland. They were not primarily interested in conquest. They were interested in trade, in the raw materials that the Illyrian interior could provide, and the markets that the Illyrian tribes represented for Greek-manufactured goods. Their most significant colony in the region was on the island of Issa, present-day Vis, from which they maintained trading relationships with the surrounding communities. They also established a presence at Epidamnos, on the coast further south in what is now Albania, and at various points along the Dalmatian island chain. The relationship between the Greek colonists and the Illyrian tribes was complicated in the way that relationships between well-organized maritime traders and the people who already live somewhere are almost always complicated. There was trade, and there was tension, and there were periods of cooperation, followed by periods of raiding, and there were marriages and cultural exchanges, and also mutual incomprehension. The Greeks brought wine in their distinctive ceramic amphorae, and olive oil, and fine pottery painted with scenes from mythology, and bronze weapons and tools. The Illyrians brought amber that had travelled down from the Baltic through a network of overland trade routes, and hides and timber and the other raw materials of a society organised primarily around agriculture and herding. And increasingly, as the Greek demand for labour grew, they brought slaves. The slave trade was already present in this corner of the ancient world. Captives taken in the frequent intertribal warfare of the Illyrian region were a commodity that moved through the trading networks of the ancient Mediterranean. The Greeks were buyers, so were the Romans, and in even larger numbers. The slave trade would remain a reality of life in the Adriatic world for more than 1,000 years after the Greeks first established their colonies on the Dalmatian coast, and its eventual abolition by the Republic of Ragusa in 1416 was all the more significant for how long it had been a feature of the economic landscape. The Romans, when they finally turned their attention to the eastern Adriatic coast, were not interested in the complexity and nuance of the Greek approach. In 229 BC, after Illyrian pirates had become too disruptive to Roman commercial interests in the Adriatic, Rome sent a fleet, and then another. The conquest of Illyria was not quick, and it was not clean, but it was eventual. The Illyrian queen Tota, who had initially dismissed the Roman demands with something close to contempt, found herself facing legions that had been hardened by decades of warfare in Italy, and that were not accustomed to being dismissed. The war went badly for the Illyrians, and the outcome was a Roman protectorate over the Adriatic coast that would deepen over the following decades into outright incorporation into the Roman provincial system. By the time the Roman Empire was fully established and Augustus was reorganizing the provinces in the last decades before the Common Era, the coast of Dalmatia was firmly Roman. Its towns were Latin-speaking. Its ports were integrated into the vast trading network that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia and carried goods to every corner of the known world. The Roman genius for administration and infrastructure had been applied to this landscape with the same thoroughness it was applied everywhere. Roads crossed the limestone ridges. Aqueducts brought water to the towns. The forum and the temple and the bathhouse appeared in settlement after settlement along the coast. The Romans built well here, as they built well everywhere. The road they built along the Dalmatian coast, connecting the harbour towns to each other and to the larger provincial network, was an engineering achievement of considerable scale, cutting through limestone and bridging the numerous small rivers and streams that carved their way through the hills to the sea. Some sections of this road are still in use today, their route so well chosen by Roman surveyors that 2,000 years of subsequent road building have not significantly improved on it. The city of Epidaurus was one of the most important Roman settlements on the southern Dalmatian coast. It sat at the end of one of the important roads, connecting the coast to the interior of the Balkans, and it prospered accordingly as a trading hub between the Adriatic sea lanes and the land routes that ran through the Slavic and Thracian interior. It had a forum and temples and public baths, and a harbour capable of accommodating the cargo ships that called at every significant port along the coast. It was, in the terminology of Roman provincial administration, a municipium, a self-governing community with Roman citizenship and the rights and obligations that came with it. The population of Epidaurus in its heyday was probably in the several thousands, a substantial settlement for this part of the world. They spoke Latin, practiced the Roman religion, and participated in the commercial life of the empire in the ways that provincial communities everywhere did. They were, in other words, Roman in the ways that mattered to the empire and themselves. This is the world that would eventually produce the city we are talking about tonight, not through any grand plan or single decisive moment, but through the slow accumulation of geography and trade and survival instinct and the particular stubbornness of people who have decided that a particular piece of rock is theirs and they intend to keep it. The Roman world lasted a long time, 4 centuries of relative stability, of roads maintained and trade flowing and legions stationed at the passes to keep the more restless peoples of the interior from spilling out onto the coast with disruptive frequency. But the Roman world was not eternal, and nothing in history is ever quite as stable as it looks from the outside. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, the pressures that had been building on the edges of the empire for generations were becoming impossible to contain. The great population movements of the period, that historians sometimes call the migration period, were reshaping the demographic landscape of Europe with a thoroughness that had not been seen since the very earliest days of settled civilization. People were moving in numbers that strained the administrative capacity of the empire to respond, and they were moving in ways that did not respect the frontiers that Roman power had established. The Western Empire fell in 476, though the falling was less a single moment than a long unraveling that stretched across decades. The formal date of the end corresponds to the deposition of Romulus Augustulus by the barbarian general Odoacer. But by that point, the Western Empire had already been fragmenting for generations, its territory divided among the successor kingdoms of various Germanic peoples who had settled within the old frontiers. For the coast of Dalmatia, the collapse of the Western Empire was complicated by the survival of the Eastern Empire. The Byzantines, based in Constantinople, considered themselves the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire, and they were not wrong to do so. They maintained the Roman legal tradition, the Roman administrative structures, the Roman cultural identity, and for some centuries, the Roman military capacity. And they maintained a presence on the Dalmatian coast, partly because the coast was valuable strategically and commercially, and partly because the claim to universal Roman authority that underpinned Byzantine legitimacy required them to hold on to Roman territory wherever they could. But the Byzantines were under pressure from all directions. The Great Plague of Justinian's reign in the 6th century, which killed a substantial fraction of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean, weakened the empire at exactly the moment it needed strength. The wars against Persia that Justinian fought to an exhausting standstill drained the treasury and the manpower. And then, in the early 7th century, came the Arab conquests, sweeping through Syria and Palestine and Egypt, with a speed that stunned the Byzantine world and stripped it of some of its most productive and populous provinces. Into the weakened and contracted Byzantine world came the Slavic migration. The Slavic peoples, originally from the area north of the Carpathian Mountains, had been moving south and west for decades, filling the demographic vacuum left by earlier population movements and by the plague. In the 6th and 7th centuries, they reached the Balkans in force, and then the coast. The process was not a single military campaign, but a long, grinding demographic transformation. Families and communities moving into territory where Roman or Byzantine administration had grown thin, establishing villages, clearing land, and eventually becoming the dominant population over a landscape they had not inhabited 2 generations earlier. The effect on the Roman towns of the Dalmatian coast was severe. Salona, the great Roman capital of the province, which had been one of the major cities of the Western Balkans, with a population in the tens of thousands, was attacked and largely abandoned in the early 7th century. Its population fled, many of them finding refuge inside the enormous retirement palace that the Emperor Diocletian had built for himself on the coast south of Salona. That palace was so large that a city grew up inside its walls. That city is now split, and the outlines of Diocletian's palace are still visible in the street plan of its old city centre. And Epidaurus, the Roman city just south of where our story is set, was also attacked, also abandoned. Its people also fled, carrying with them what they could carry, leaving behind the marble columns and the tiled floors and the administrative machinery of 4 centuries of organised Roman provincial life. The stone would be quarried for centuries afterward by the people who came after. Much of what had been Epidaurus went into the walls and buildings of the medieval communities that grew up around it. The refugees from Epidaurus went north along the coast to a rocky promontory, a small peninsula almost entirely surrounded by water. A narrow channel separated it from the mainland, a channel perhaps 30 or 40 meters wide at its narrowest point, shallow enough to wade across at low tide. The rock on which they settled was not hospitable. Its soil was thin, almost non-existent in places. Its water came from cisterns that captured rain or from springs that required effort to reach. The sun in summer heated the pale limestone until it was almost painful to touch, and the Bora wind in winter came off the mountains with a force that drove the spray from the Adriatic straight into your face, no matter which way you turned. But the channel could be controlled. The cliffs on the seaward sides were steep, and the sea on the open sides was rough enough to discourage casual approach by boats. And the rock was high enough above the surrounding terrain that from its edges you could see a considerable distance in every direction. A threat approaching from the sea could be seen and responded to. An approach from the mainland could be monitored and, if necessary, defended with far fewer men than would be required to defend an open town. In the 7th century, with Slavic warriors moving through the coastal hinterland with unpredictable frequency and Byzantine naval protection, intermittent at best, defensible was the quality that mattered most. Beauty could wait, comfort could wait, enough food and enough water and walls you could defend, those were what you needed. Everything else was secondary. The name they gave the settlement, or the name it acquired through the speech patterns of the people who lived there and the people they talked to, came from the Latin word for rock or crag, Ragusa or Los. From Ragusa it became Ragusa, filtered through the centuries of pronunciation and the contact with the South Slavic languages spoken by the people on the mainland opposite. And the people on the mainland, the Slavic community that settled among the oak forests on the slopes facing the settlement on the rock, called it by their own word, Dubrovnik. From Dubrava, an oak forest or an oak grove, the city of the oaks, as seen by the people who watched it from the trees. For a long time, these were two separate communities. The Latin-speaking descendants of the Epidaurian refugees on their rocky peninsula, the Slavic community on the mainland opposite, among the oaks and the limestone slopes. The channel between them was not wide, but it was a real boundary, physical and cultural and linguistic all at once. The community on the rock spoke Latin, or the variety of Latin that was evolving toward the medieval Dalmatian Romance dialect that linguists call Dalmatian, and that eventually died out entirely as the Slavic languages absorbed it. The community among the oaks spoke an early form of what would become Croatian. They traded. They had to trade. The rock could not sustain its own population without food from the mainland. The mainland community needed the access to the sea routes that the community on the rock could provide. The relationship was one of mutual necessity, and mutual necessity over time has a way of building the habits and the trust that eventually make union possible. The channel between them was filled in, sometime in the 10th or 11th century, the dating uncertain, as so many things from this period are uncertain. Limestone rubble was carried and packed into the water until the channel was dry land, and on that land was built the street that became the Stradon, wide enough for several people to walk abreast. Running straight from one end of the city to the other, the Stradon is one of the most distinctive streets in Europe, not because of its architecture, though the architecture that lines it is beautiful, but because of what it represents. It is the physical trace of the moment when two communities decided to become one, but that moment and the centuries of development that followed it were still in the future. First, there was the long period of Byzantine connection, the years when Ragusa existed in the shadow of the Eastern Empire and learned from that shadow what it needed to know to eventually stand on its own. The Byzantine Empire of the 7th and 8th centuries was not the empire it had been. The plague, the Persian wars, the Arab conquests had all taken their toll. The great circuit of Mediterranean trade that the empire had once organized and protected was disrupted. The administrative machine that had governed the provinces with such systematic efficiency was overburdened and undermanned. In many places, the empire's reach was nominal, a claim to authority that could not always be backed by actual power. For Ragusa, this meant something specific and consequential. The protection that Byzantine naval power provided was real, but it was not absolute, and it was not constant. The Byzantine fleet could appear in the Adriatic, and its appearance was a deterrent, a message to anyone contemplating aggression against the cities under Byzantine protection that there would be a response. But the fleet could not be everywhere, and its priorities were set by the empire's own calculations of strategic interest, not by the needs of individual small communities on the fringes of its attention. This was the environment in which the early Ragusan community formed its fundamental habits of thought about power and survival. The lesson was simple and unavoidable. You could not rely on anyone else to protect you. Not entirely, not always. You had to be able to contribute to your own defense and to manage your own relationships with the powers around you, because the day would always come when your protector was looking elsewhere and you were on your own. This lesson, learned in the earliest centuries of the settlement's existence, shaped everything that came after. It created an instinct for self-reliance that was not the aggressive self-sufficiency of a military power, but the careful, attentive self-reliance of a community that understands that survival requires management. You had to know who your neighbors were and what they wanted. You had to know how much they were willing to pay to get it, and how much pressure they were willing to apply if they were not getting it. You had to keep those relationships current, because the circumstances changed, and relationships that were fine last year might require recalibration this year. The Slavic kingdoms that grew up around Ragusa in the early medieval period presented the city with its first sustained exercise in the management of multiple relationships simultaneously. To the north, the Kingdom of Croatia was consolidating itself under the Tripimirovic dynasty in the 9th century. To the south and southeast, the Principality of Zeta, which would later become the kingdom of that name and eventually contribute to what is now Montenegro, was the dominant power. Further into the interior, the various Serb principalities and the Bulgarian kingdom were developing and expanding, and all of these entities looked at the small, prosperous community on the Dalmatian coast with an interest that ranged from admiration to covetousness. The key insight that Ragusa developed in this period was the difference between sovereignty and survival. Sovereignty, in the medieval sense, meant that a ruler had legal authority over you, could demand your allegiance, your taxes, your military service. Survival meant that you continued to exist as a functioning community, with your internal arrangements intact, your trade continuing, your people fed and housed and safe. For a large and powerful state, sovereignty and survival were usually the same question. For a small city-state surrounded by larger powers, they were quite different questions, and the answers to them were not the same. Ragusa decided, very early, that survival mattered more than the formal attributes of sovereignty. If paying a tribute to the King of Croatia or the Prince of Zeta was the price of being left alone to conduct its own internal affairs and its own trade, it would pay that tribute. Not cheerfully, not without negotiation, not without careful attention to whether it was getting value for the money. But it would pay, because the alternative to paying was fighting, and fighting meant destruction, and destruction was the end of everything. The tribute system that Ragusa developed in this period was one of the most pragmatic financial arrangements in medieval European history. The city paid what were essentially protection rents to the various rulers who surrounded it. The amounts were calibrated carefully. Too little invited contempt and aggression. Too much invited dependence and the gradual assertion of more control. The right amount was the amount that communicated respect, without surrendering independence, that made you a useful and reliable client, without making you a subordinate whose resources could be exploited without limit. Finding that right amount required constant information. You had to know how financially pressed the ruler you were paying was at any given moment, because a ruler in financial difficulty might demand more than the established rate, and you needed to know whether to comply or to push back. You had to know his relationship with his own nobility, because a ruler whose nobles were restless needed the city's trade more than usual and could be negotiated with more firmly on that basis. You had to know whether he had military ambitions in any direction that would make conflict with the city costly for him, because the threat of complicated his plans was always useful leverage. This constant, systematic attention to the information environment in which the city operated was the foundation of Ragusan diplomacy for the entirety of its history. It was not instinctive, it was institutional. The men who conducted these negotiations were trained for it, informed by the accumulated experience of previous generations, and accountable to a governing body that reviewed their work and expected results. The institution preceded the individuals and outlasted them, which is what made it durable. There is a quality in the early history of Ragusa that distinguishes it from the histories of many other medieval cities, and that quality is the relatively early development of a legal culture. Most medieval communities were governed more by custom than by written law, by the judgments of powerful individuals than by codified rules. Ragusa, inheriting from its Byzantine connection a respect for the written law and the systematic administration of it, moved relatively early toward the codification and formalization of its legal arrangements. The Byzantine gift to this small community on the Adriatic coast was not primarily military, though Byzantine naval protection mattered. It was administrative and legal. The Byzantines had preserved and adapted the great tradition of Roman law, the corpus juris civilis, that the Emperor Justinian had compiled in the 6th century as a systematic codification of Roman legal knowledge. Through its Byzantine connection, Ragusa had access to this tradition, and the city's growing class of administrators and legal professionals absorbed it and used it. What the Roman legal tradition provided was not just a set of rules, but a way of thinking about the relationship between the state and the individual, about property and contract, and obligation and rights. It provided the conceptual vocabulary through which a community could define itself as a legal entity, as a polity with standing in the world of international relations, rather than simply as a group of people living in the same place. And it provided the institutional framework through which law could be administered systematically rather than arbitrarily. For Ragusa, this mattered in a very direct way. A city that wanted to conduct trade across national boundaries needed legal frameworks that were recognized and respected by the parties it was trading with. Merchants who deposited goods in Ragusan warehouses needed to know that those goods were protected by law and that if anything went wrong, there was a legal mechanism through which they could seek redress. Foreign rulers who made agreements with Ragusan representatives needed to know that those agreements would be honored, not because Ragusa was too weak to break them, but because the legal and institutional culture of the city treated the honoring of agreements as a fundamental obligation. Trust, in other words, required institutions, and institutions required law. This is a lesson that sounds obvious when stated directly, but that many communities in the medieval world never fully internalized, precisely because their governance was too dependent on the personalities of individual rulers whose trustworthiness varied and whose successors were unpredictable. Ragusa was building, from its earliest period, a system in which trust was generated by the institution rather than by the individual. Not perfectly. The individuals who ran the institutions mattered, and bad individual judgment sometimes caused real harm. But the institutions provided a kind of continuity and accountability that individual judgment alone could never provide. And over the long arc of the city's history, that institutional continuity was what made sustained trust possible. By the 12th and 13th centuries, when the formal legal codification of Ragusan law was being undertaken, the city already had several centuries of institutional practice behind it. The Statute of Ragusa, first compiled in comprehensive form in 1272, was the product of that accumulated practice, a codification of what the city had already been doing, rather than a blueprint for what it intended to start doing. Its comprehensiveness, covering everything from property rights to criminal procedure, to trade regulation, to the governance of the city's harbour and its marketplace, was the mark of a community that had been thinking seriously about these questions for a long time. The statute also included provisions that reflected the particular concerns of a trading city in a dangerous world. It regulated the behaviour of merchants in the city's markets. It set standards for the quality of goods that could be sold under the city's seal. It established procedures for the resolution of commercial disputes that were designed to be fast enough to be practically useful, because a dispute that dragged on for years while the goods in question spoiled or the trading season passed was a dispute that had failed both parties, regardless of its eventual legal resolution, and the statute reflected the city's growing self-confidence about its own status. It did not present itself as a body of law given by a sovereign to his subjects. It presented itself as the law of the commune of Ragusa, the self-governing community of citizens who had established these rules for their own governance. The legal tradition was being claimed by the community as its own, not received from outside. The Venetians had been extending their commercial reach down the Dalmatian coast for generations when, in 1000 AD, the Venetian Doge Pietro II Orseolo led a fleet in a campaign that asserted Venetian dominance over the entire eastern shore of the Adriatic. The campaign was well organized, and the resistance from most of the Dalmatian communities was limited. The Doge added the title Duke of Dalmatia to his existing honors, and Venice had, at least in its own accounting, acquired the eastern shore of its home sea. The significance of this moment for Ragusa was considerable, but it was not quite what it appeared to be. Venice, in 1000 AD, was already a major commercial power, but it was not yet the dominant force in the Mediterranean that it would become over the following 2 centuries. Its control of the Dalmatian coast was more nominal than effective in many places, and the relationship it established with individual communities along the coast varied considerably depending on local circumstances. For Ragusa, the relationship with Venice was from the beginning a negotiation rather than a submission. The city acknowledged a form of Venetian authority, because not acknowledging it would have meant facing the Venetian fleet without any realistic prospect of winning. But the form of that acknowledgement was carefully shaped by Ragusan legal and diplomatic skill. The city's internal governance was preserved. The Ragusan nobility continued to hold the offices of local government. Venetian authority expressed itself primarily through the appointment of certain officials and through the commercial privileges that Venetian merchants received in Ragusan ports, privileges that were real but not unlimited. What the Ragusans lost in this period was not their institutions, but their capacity to project power beyond their own walls. They could not conduct an independent foreign policy. They could not make treaties with other powers without Venetian approval. Their ships operated within a commercial framework that Venetian rules defined. This was a real constraint, and the Ragusan nobility resented it with a steadiness that never diminished over the century and a half of Venetian dominance. But they were patient. Patience was one of the skills the city had been developing since its earliest days, and the particular kind of patience required now was the patience of people who understood that their situation was going to change, because all situations change, and that the most important thing in the meantime was to preserve the institutional capacity that would allow them to take advantage of that change when it came. The Venetian period, for all its frustrations, also provided something valuable. Being closely tied to Venice for 145 years meant that Ragusan merchants and administrators learned how Venice worked from the inside. They saw how the Venetians managed their commercial empire, how they structured their trading arrangements, how they administered their dependencies, what kinds of information they valued, and how they processed it. They were, in effect, studying their future competition at close range, and they were good students. The commercial skills and the institutional habits they observed and absorbed during the Venetian period became, after independence, the tools with which they competed against Venice in the Adriatic and Mediterranean markets. The Ragusans did not simply copy what they had seen. They adapted it. They modified the Venetian commercial techniques for the circumstances of a city that did not have Venice's resources or Venice's military backing, that had to operate by wit and reputation rather than by power. The result was a commercial approach that was in some respects more sophisticated than what Venice practiced, precisely because it had to be. You become most creative when you cannot simply impose your will. The formal liberation of Ragusa from Venetian authority came in 1358 through the Peace of Zadar, which required Venice to renounce its claims to the Dalmatian coast. The city moved with characteristic speed to establish the terms of its new relationship with the Hungarian king Louis I, and the terms it obtained were everything the Ragusan nobility had been working toward for more than a century. Formal acknowledgement of Hungarian sovereignty, an annual tribute payment, the right to fly the Hungarian flag on Ragusan ships. In exchange, full internal autonomy, the right to govern themselves, to elect their own officials, to administer their own laws, to conduct their own trade without interference from the Hungarian court. The King of Hungary was far away in Buda and had no particular interest in the day-to-day governance of a small coastal city. What he wanted was the tribute and the trade access and those he received. What Ragusa wanted was freedom to govern itself, and that it received. The half-century that followed was the most creative period in Ragusan constitutional history. The institutions that the city had been developing for centuries were now formalized, codified, given the specific shape that they would maintain for the next 4.5 centuries. The Great Council, the Senate, the Small Council, the Rector, all of these institutions existed in some form before 1358. After 1358, they were refined into the particular constitutional arrangement that would define the Republic of Ragusa for the remainder of its existence. The Rector's 1-month term was one of the most radical features of this arrangement. In a world where most governments were monarchies or oligarchies governed by powerful individuals who held office for life or hereditary terms, The idea that the head of state would change every month was deeply unconventional. It meant that the rector was always, in effect, a guest in the office rather than its owner. He could not build a personal following over years in the position. He could not use the resources of the office to entrench himself or his family. He was constrained from the moment he entered the rector's palace by the knowledge that he would leave it in 30 days. The effect of this arrangement was to concentrate real power in the collective institutions of the nobility rather than in any individual. The Senate and the Great Council were the permanent centers of decision-making. The rector gave the system a focal point, a representative figure who could receive foreign ambassadors and conduct ceremonial functions. But the substance of policy was always a collective product. This had consequences for the quality of governance that went beyond the simple prevention of tyranny. It meant that governance in Ragusa was always a practice of negotiation and persuasion rather than command. A rector who wanted to accomplish something during his month in office had to persuade the Senate. A senator who wanted to shift policy had to argue his case to colleagues who might disagree. The deliberative processes of the Republic, which visitors sometimes found tediously slow, were actually the mechanism through which the intelligence of the collective was brought to bear on the problems the city faced. No single individual's judgment, however good, was as good as the collective judgment of a well-informed and well-organized governing body, and the Ragusan system was designed to make that collective judgment as good as it could be. The secrecy provisions that surrounded the Senate's deliberations were another remarkable feature of the constitutional arrangement. Not just confidential, not just restricted in distribution, but genuinely secret. Senators who revealed the content of their deliberations faced penalties that were designed to be deterrent. The rationale was openly stated. A small state conducting diplomacy with much larger powers could not afford to have its negotiating positions known, and so the Senate's discussions were protected with a seriousness that made Ragusan decision-making genuinely opaque to the outside world. This opacity was an advantage that the Ragusans exploited with considerable skill. When they negotiated with the Ottoman court, the Ottomans knew what terms Ragusa was offering, but not what alternatives the Senate was considering. When they dealt with Venice, or with the papacy, or with any of the other powers that had interest in the city, those powers were operating with incomplete information about Ragusan intentions. The city's negotiators could engage in the kind of multi-party diplomacy that requires each party to believe you are dealing with them more favorably than you are dealing with their rivals, and as long as the deliberations remained secret, that belief could be maintained. The legal abolition of the slave trade in 1416 deserves its own extended consideration, because it was an act so out of keeping with the norms of the period that it demands explanation. The medieval Mediterranean was a world in which slavery was ubiquitous. The trade in human beings moved through the same networks as the trade in cloth and spices and metals, was handled by the same merchants and transported on the same ships, and was integrated into the economic life of every Mediterranean city in ways that were so thoroughgoing that most people who lived within that system gave it no more moral thought than they gave to the trade in wool or grain. Slaves worked in the fields, in the workshops, in the households of the wealthy, in the mines, in the ports. They were present everywhere, and they were economically essential in ways that made the idea of their absence genuinely difficult to think about for most people in this period. Ragusa had participated in this trade from its earliest days. The city's geographical position, at the meeting point of the Balkan interior and the Adriatic sea lanes, made it a natural transit point for people being moved from the interior to the coastal markets and from there to buyers across the Mediterranean. Ragusan merchants handled this trade in the same business-like way that they handled every other trade. And then they stopped. In 1416, the Great Council passed a law abolishing the trade. The law was comprehensive. It applied to Ragusan citizens anywhere in the world, not just within the city's territory. A Ragusan merchant who participated in the slave trade in Alexandria or Lisbon or Constantinople was in violation of the law of his city and subject to its penalties. The penalties included fines and the loss of the right to trade under the Republic's protection, which was a serious commercial sanction. The motivations were not purely altruistic. They never are in politics, and there is no reason to expect otherwise. The practical calculation was probably something like this. The slave trade was a morally contested practice that created reputational problems for a city whose commercial standing depended on being seen as trustworthy and law-abiding. It was also a practice that generated enemies, because people who had been enslaved and their families and their communities did not forget who had enslaved them, and it was increasingly out of step with the developing legal culture of Christian Europe, which was, slowly and inconsistently, moving toward the position that the enslavement of fellow Christians was problematic in ways that the enslavement of pagans was not. None of this fully explains the decision, which was more radical than the practical calculation strictly required. They could have restricted the trade, limited it, applied it only in certain circumstances. Instead, they abolished it outright. Something in the collective judgment of the Great Council in 1416 concluded that this was the right thing to do, and the law was passed and maintained and enforced 370 years before the British Parliament abolished the slave trade in 1807, 387 years before the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery itself in 1865. The Republic of Ragusa made this choice in 1416 and kept it. The commercial life of the Republic, at its height, is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of trade. The Ragusan merchant fleet in the 15th century was one of the largest in the Mediterranean, numbering at certain points more than 300 vessels, ranging from small coastal craft to large ocean-going ships, capable of carrying several hundred tons of cargo. These ships sailed routes that stretched from the Atlantic coast of England and Flanders in the north and west to Alexandria and the ports of the Levant in the east and south, connecting markets that were otherwise poorly served by direct links. The goods they carried were the goods that made the medieval world run. From England they brought wool, which was the essential raw material for the cloth-making industries of Florence and Flanders. From the Flemish cloth-making cities they carried the finished wool cloth eastward, where it found markets across the Mediterranean and into the Ottoman territories of the Balkans and Anatolia. From the Levant and from the Ottoman markets they carried spices, pepper and ginger and cinnamon, and the dozens of other aromatic substances that medieval Europeans used in extraordinary quantities for cooking and medicine, and the preservation of food and the masking of the smells that were an unavoidable feature of pre-modern urban life. But the most important goods in the Ragusan commercial system were the metals that came from the Balkan mines. The silver and copper of Bosnia and Serbia, and later the lead and gold from the mines of Kosovo, were the foundations of the city's prosperity in the 14th and 15th centuries. And understanding the mechanics of this trade is essential to understanding why Ragusa was commercially so significant. The Balkan mines, particularly the silver mines at Novo Brado in Serbia and the great silver and lead complex at Srebrenica in Bosnia, produced more silver than any other mines in Europe during the height of their productivity in the 14th and early 15th centuries. This silver was essential. Medieval European economies were silver economies. Coins were silver. International trade was settled in silver. The great banking houses of Florence and Genoa and Venice, which financed everything from merchant voyages to papal crusades to the construction of cathedrals, needed silver to operate, and the Balkans were producing it in quantities that exceeded anything available elsewhere in Europe. The problem, from the perspective of the mine owners and the rulers who taxed them, was getting the silver out of the mountains and into the markets where it was needed. The mines were in the interior, connected to the coast by mountain passes and river valleys that were rough going in summer and nearly impassable in winter. The journey from Novo Brado or Srebrenica to the Adriatic coast was several days of hard travel over poor roads, through territory where bandits operated and where the political situation was always in flux. Ragusan merchants solved this problem by going where the silver was. They established trading posts in the mining towns, then in the larger commercial centers of the interior, building a network of presence that allowed them to buy silver at the source and arrange its transport to the coast under conditions they controlled. The trading posts grew into permanent establishments with warehouses, and weighing facilities and money-changing operations, and the full array of commercial services that the trade in precious metals required. In the commercial towns of Bosnia and Serbia, the Ragusan merchants became fixtures of urban economic life. They extended credit to the mine owners, effectively financing the expansion of operations in exchange for guaranteed purchase prices on the silver produced. They arranged the transport caravans that moved the silver to the coast, contracting with local teamsters and guards, and managing the logistics of multi-day journeys through difficult terrain. They provided the money-changing services that converted the silver into the various currencies that different parties in the transaction needed to operate. And in exchange for all of this, they took a margin on every transaction. The silver they bought at the mines was worth more at the coast than in the interior. The cloth they sold in the interior markets was worth more there than in Ragusa. Every transaction in the network produced a profit, and the network was large enough that the accumulated profits were substantial. The wealth this generated transformed Ragusa. The city in the high period of the 14th and 15th centuries was prosperous enough to build and maintain the institutions and infrastructure that defined it as a major city rather than just a large town. The walls were expanded and reinforced to their current extent. The great civic buildings were constructed. The water supply system was extended and improved. The churches and monasteries received the donations of wealthy merchants who wanted to secure their spiritual standing while also investing in the institutions that made their city function. And the city invested in culture. Poetry was written in the vernacular, the developing Croatian language that the Slavic inhabitants of the city spoke alongside the Latin of the administrative and legal tradition. Drama was performed in a theatrical tradition that has a claim to being the earliest sustained vernacular dramatic writing in the South Slavic world. Philosophy was studied. Mathematics and astronomy were practiced. The city supported the learning and the arts, not just as luxuries, but as markers of its status as a civilized community, a republic worthy of the respect of the Italian and Byzantine cities it traded with. The Republic also invested in education with a seriousness that went beyond mere reputation building. The monasteries, both Franciscan and Dominican, maintained schools where the children of the nobility and eventually of the broader citizen class could receive a serious education in Latin, theology, law, and the liberal arts. The city also supported individual scholars and eventually established more formal educational institutions. The understanding was practical as well as cultural. A city that needed to conduct sophisticated diplomacy, that needed lawyers to write and interpret its contracts and administrators to run its institutions, that needed merchants capable of operating in the complex, multilingual commercial world of the late medieval Mediterranean, required educated people. And producing educated people required investment in education. The Republic's hospitals and charitable institutions were also supported from public funds in ways that went beyond what most cities of comparable size provided. The hospital, established in the 14th century, cared for the sick regardless of their social status. The hospice for travelers provided accommodation for merchants and pilgrims passing through the city. The public fountain system brought clean water to all parts of the city, not just to the wealthy neighborhoods. These provisions were not primarily humanitarian in their motivation. They were the practical infrastructure of a city that understood that its prosperity depended on its attractiveness to the merchants and skilled people it needed to function, and that attractiveness required maintaining a standard of urban life that compared favorably with what was available elsewhere. The Ottoman Empire's arrival as the dominant power in the Balkans was one of the most consequential developments in the history of the region, and for Ragusa, it was simultaneously one of the greatest threats and one of the greatest opportunities the city had ever faced. The Ottomans had been pressing into southeastern Europe since the late 14th century, establishing their presence first in Thrace and then gradually extending it westward and northward through the Balkans. The Serbian defeat at Kosovo in 1389 was the critical moment when the trajectory of the Ottoman advance became clear to everyone in the region. What followed was a decades-long process of absorption, as the various Serbian and Bulgarian and Bosnian principalities were incorporated into the Ottoman system one by one, sometimes through direct military conquest, and sometimes through the more gradual mechanism of tribute payment and increasing dependence. Ragusa watched this process with the close attention that survival required. The city's trading posts in the interior were directly affected by the political changes. Serbian mine owners, who had been their commercial partners, were replaced by Ottoman administrators. The legal frameworks within which they had operated were replaced by Ottoman law. The rulers they had cultivated were gone, and new rulers with different interests and different expectations had taken their places. The response was adaptation. The city sent diplomats to the Ottoman court even before the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. It established relationships with Ottoman officials at every level of the imperial hierarchy, from the Grand Viziers who ran the day-to-day administration of the empire, to the local Sanjak Beys who controlled the territories where Ragusan merchants operated. These relationships required the same careful maintenance that all Ragusan diplomatic relationships required: calibrated payments of gifts and money, and formal expressions of respect, combined with the delivery of genuinely useful services that made the relationship worth maintaining from the Ottoman side. The formal commercial agreement that Ragusa eventually negotiated with the Ottoman court, usually referred to as the ahidname or the capitulation, was one of the most valuable commercial arrangements in the history of the city. Under its terms, Ragusan merchants received the right to trade throughout the Ottoman Empire on the same or better terms than the empire's own subjects. They could operate in Istanbul and in the trading cities of Anatolia and in the ports of Egypt and the Levant. They could move through Ottoman territory without the restrictions that applied to other foreign traders, and their ships, sailing the Ottoman-controlled waters of the eastern Mediterranean, flew under the protection of the Sultan's authority. In exchange, Ragusa paid an annual tribute, diplomatically described as a gift but understood by all parties as the price of the commercial privileges. The amount varied over the years, negotiated and renegotiated as circumstances changed, but it was substantial enough to represent a real cost and modest enough not to be crippling. The Ragusans were skillful enough negotiators that they never paid more than the minimum the Ottomans found acceptable, and they monitored the Ottoman court's current mood and financial situation carefully enough to know when pushing back on a demand would be effective and when compliance was the cheaper option. The tribute arrangement created a problem in the Republic's relationships with the Christian powers of Europe: the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish crown. The various Christian kingdoms that were in one degree or another engaged in the ongoing contest with Ottoman power all looked at a city that was paying annual tribute to the Sultan with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. Was Ragusa a Christian commonwealth, as it presented itself, or was it an Ottoman dependency dressed in Christian clothes? The Ragusans managed this perception problem with considerable ingenuity. Their formal Christian identity was maintained with an almost theatrical enthusiasm. The cult of Saint Blaise was celebrated with elaborate ceremony. The city's churches were maintained and adorned. Donations were made to the papacy. Ambassadors were sent to Rome with expressions of filial piety toward the Holy Father. The city took care never to position itself as formally opposed to the Christian cause, even when its commercial arrangements with the Ottomans were the subject of criticism. At the same time, the Ragusans quietly made themselves useful to the Christian powers in ways that were not possible for a city in active conflict with the Ottomans. Because Ragusan merchants operated throughout Ottoman territory, they had access to information about Ottoman military preparations and commercial conditions that was not available through any other channel. When this information was valuable to a Christian power, the Ragusans could share it at a price, and in doing so demonstrate their continuing utility to the Christian cause, even while maintaining their Ottoman commercial relationships. This dual position, useful to both sides in a conflict that was defining the geopolitics of the Mediterranean world, was the most sophisticated expression of the Ragusan diplomatic approach. It required absolute consistency in the maintenance of formal neutrality, because any deviation from strict neutrality would destroy the trust on which both relationships depended. It required a continuous and delicate calibration of what to share and with whom. And it required the kind of long-term institutional commitment to a strategic approach that only a governing body with genuine continuity and genuine secrecy could maintain. Individual rulers make different calculations than institutions. A king who is personally passionate about the crusade against Ottoman power might be unable to maintain the neutrality that his predecessors had developed. A king who has a personal animosity toward Venice might blow up a commercial relationship that took generations to build. The Republic's institutional character, the fact that its policy was made collectively and changed only through the laborious process of persuading the Senate, meant that it was structurally resistant to the kind of personality-driven policy swings that afflicted neighboring states. The institutional inertia that sometimes frustrated Ragusans who wanted faster action was also the mechanism that prevented the impulsive decisions that would have ended the Republic's strategic position. The Ottoman relationship reached its most complex period in the 16th century, when the empire was at the height of its power under Suleiman the Magnificent, and when the conflict between Ottoman and Habsburg power was reshaping the entire Mediterranean world. The Great Naval Battle of Lepanto in 1571, at which the combined Christian fleet destroyed the Ottoman naval force and temporarily halted Ottoman naval expansion, was one of the defining moments of the century. Ragusa sent no ships to either fleet. The city received diplomatic pressure from both sides to commit, and it deflected that pressure with the skill and consistency it had been developing for generations. It was neutral. It had always been neutral. It would remain neutral. Anyone who needed a neutral intermediary knew where to find one. The Spanish Empire under Philip II found the Ragusan position genuinely useful on several occasions. The Ragusans could carry messages between Madrid and Istanbul through channels that official ambassadors could not use. They could provide market intelligence about Ottoman commercial conditions that the Spanish needed for commercial decisions that had strategic implications. And they could provide the Republic's excellent ships to carry Spanish goods through waters where Spanish vessels were not welcome. This last arrangement had a darker chapter. In 1588, the Spanish Armada that Philip II sent against England included a number of ships owned by Ragusan merchants, Ragusans sailing under Spanish contracts to carry soldiers and supplies. The Armada's famous defeat in the English Channel and the subsequent storms that destroyed most of what remained of it were catastrophic for the Ragusan merchants who had invested in the enterprise. The losses were significant, but the Republic itself survived the disaster without political consequences because its formal neutrality was intact. The merchants who had participated did so as private commercial contractors, not as representatives of the Republic. The distinction was not always convincing to outside observers, but it was the distinction Ragusa maintained, and it was enough. The daily life of the city, in its mature period, was rich and detailed in ways that the historical record allows us to reconstruct, if not completely, at least in considerable depth. The chronicles of the Republic, the diplomatic correspondence, the legal records, the minutes of the Senate and the Great Council, the accounts of travelers and visitors, all of these sources fill in the picture of a community that was more complex and more interesting than its small size might suggest. The Straden, the great central street that ran from the Pile Gate to the Ploce Gate, was the axis around which public life organized itself. In the morning, from the earliest light, it filled with the noise and movement of the marketplace. The shops that lined its lower floors opened their shutters and displayed their goods. The craftspeople set up their stalls. The merchants arrived from the harbour with samples of goods they were buying and selling. The officials of the Republic made their way to the buildings where they worked. The monks from the Franciscan monastery at one end and the Dominican monastery at the other crossed paths in the middle, on their way to whatever the day required of them. The Straden in the middle of a market day was a condensed summary of the city's social life. Here was the senator, distinguished by the cut and colour of his robe, making his way to the rector's palace. Here was the merchant from Florence, distinguishable by his accent and his fashionable clothes, looking for the Ragusan trading house, where he was to meet his counterpart. Here was the craftsman, who made the bronze fittings for ships, his hands marked by his trade, delivering a finished piece to a customer. Here was the woman who sold herbs and medicines at a small stand near the fountain, known to everyone in the quarter for the quality of her remedies. Here was the sailor, just arrived from a weeks-long voyage, looking for the harbour tavern where he could spend some of his pay and hear the latest news. The social stratification was visible in the clothes people wore, the routes they took through the city, the parts of the Stradon where they gathered. The nobles clustered toward the eastern end, near the rector's palace and the cathedral. The working people of the various trades organised themselves by profession in the streets that ran off the Stradon to the north and south. The harbour area at the eastern end of the city was the domain of the maritime trades, the shipwrights and the rope makers and the caulkers and the sailors and the factors who managed the cargo. The workshops of the city produced a range of goods that reflected both the city's needs and its commercial connections. Goldsmiths and silversmiths worked the metals that came from the Balkan mines into jewellery and religious objects and the decorative items that wealthy households and churches desired. Weavers worked the wool that came from the Dalmatian hinterland and from the interior trade into cloth. Tanners worked the hides. Ceramicists produced the earthenware vessels that the city's households used for cooking and storage. Glass blowers made the glass that the city's buildings required, and that the perfume trade, which was one of Ragusa's specialized commercial niches, needed in considerable quantities. The food of the city was the food of the Adriatic coast, heavy on fish and seafood, supplemented by the olive oil and wine that the thin limestone soils could produce, and by the vegetables and grains that came from the more fertile valleys inland. The city's markets were supplied from the surrounding hinterland, from the islands of the Dalmatian chain, and from the trading ships that brought goods from across the Mediterranean. In the good years, the city was well fed. In the difficult years, when drought or war interrupted the supply chains, the city relied on its warehousing and its trading connections to maintain adequate supplies. The festivals of the year marked the rhythm of communal life, with the particular ceremonies that the Republic had developed over centuries. The Feast of Seat, Blaze on the 1st of February, was the great civic occasion when the entire population of the city participated in the procession that carried the relics of the patron saint through the streets, and when the Republic affirmed, before God and before each other, and before any foreign observers who happened to be present, its identity as a Christian commonwealth. The ceremony was elaborate and precisely organized, with different groups of citizens and different civic dignitaries playing defined roles that had been assigned by long tradition. Other festivals marked the agricultural calendar, the religious year, the political anniversaries that the Republic chose to remember. The city was a community that understood the importance of shared ceremony in maintaining the bonds of solidarity that kept a diverse and sometimes fractious population coherent. The nobles and the craftspeople and the sailors and the monks and the visiting merchants all participated in the same ceremonial life, walked the same streets during the same festivals, stood in the same churches during the same services. The shared ceremony was not just decoration. It was one of the mechanisms through which the Republic maintained the social cohesion without which its institutions could not function. The harbour of the city was the heart of its economic life, and one of the engineering achievements of which the Republic was justifiably proud. The natural harbour at the eastern end of the city, protected by the walls and by the small island of Locrum offshore, was supplemented by the constructed breakwaters and piers that allowed large cargo ships to dock and unload in conditions of reasonable security. The harbour was managed with the same systematic attention to detail that characterized every aspect of Ragusan administration. Fees were charged, regulations were enforced, the quality of goods passing through was inspected, the movement of ships was recorded. The customs house, which sat adjacent to the harbour, was one of the most important buildings in the city's administrative life. It was here that the taxes on goods entering and leaving the Republic were assessed and collected, and those taxes were a major source of the revenue that funded the city's operations. The customs officials were appointed by the Republic and were responsible to the Senate. The records they kept were detailed and systematic, and some of those records survive to this day, providing historians with extraordinary detail about the volume and character of Ragusan trade over the centuries. The earthquake of the 6th of April, 1667, was not the first natural catastrophe that Ragusa had experienced. The city sat in an earthquake-prone region and had been shaken by lesser tremors many times over the centuries. There had been damaging fires. There had been floods when the winter storms drove the sea over the lower parts of the harbour. There had been plagues, multiple outbreaks of the bubonic plague and other epidemic diseases over the preceding 3 centuries, each one claiming a portion of the population and disrupting the commercial and civic life of the city. But nothing in the city's experience had prepared it for what happened on that April morning in 1667. The earthquake struck shortly after 7 in the morning, when the city was active, when the harbour was working, and the streets were beginning to fill with the movement of another day. The epicenter was apparently just offshore, close enough to the city that the shock reached it with maximum force and minimum warning. There was the sound, which survivors described as a roar like thunder, but underground, and then the ground moved in a way that the ground had never moved before, not in anyone's living memory. The tremor lasted perhaps 30 seconds. That is not a long time by any ordinary measure, but in an earthquake of sufficient intensity, 30 seconds is more than enough to bring down every vulnerable structure in a city built primarily of stone. The buildings of Ragusa were built of limestone, heavy and well constructed by the standards of their time, but designed for vertical loads and not for the lateral forces that a major earthquake generates. When the ground moved sideways, the walls cracked. When the walls cracked, the floors above them lost their support. The roofs of the great civic buildings collapsed inward. The upper floors of private houses fell into the rooms below. The churches, with their tall walls and their heavy roofs, were particularly vulnerable, and most of them came down or were severely damaged. The death toll was catastrophic. Contemporary estimates suggested that between 3,000 and 5,000 people died in the immediate collapse and in the fires that followed. When collapsed, cooking fires and overturned oil lamps set the rubble alight in a dozen places simultaneously. The fires burned for days, consuming the wooden portions of the buildings that the initial earthquake had left standing and the contents of the warehouses where cloth and grain and other combustible goods were stored. The rector of the Republic, Sinisa Gunjulix, died in the collapse of the rector's palace. Most of the members of the Senate, who were gathered there for the morning's business, also died. The archbishop was killed when the cathedral collapsed. The wealthiest noble families, who lived in the most elaborate and therefore most structurally complex houses in the city centre, suffered disproportionate losses. In a matter of minutes, the governing class of the Republic had been halved. The chaos of the immediate aftermath was beyond anything the city had previously experienced. Survivors dug in the rubble with their hands looking for family members. The fires spread, and there was no organised response because there was no functioning organisation left. People from the surrounding countryside, hearing the noise and seeing the smoke, came down to the city and in some cases helped with rescue efforts, and in other cases used the chaos to loot what they could from the collapsed buildings. The response that eventually emerged was a testament to the depth of the institutional culture that the Republic had built over centuries. Even with most of its senior officials dead, even with its physical headquarters in ruins, even with the shock and grief of the disaster, the Republic began to reconstitute itself within days. The surviving members of the Great Council gathered in whatever open space they could find, because the buildings were not safe. An emergency session was convened. The immediate priorities were identified. The fire had to be brought under control. The harbour had to be inspected and cleared of debris so that ships could still use it. The water supply had to be restored because the earthquake had damaged the aqueduct system and the cisterns, and the city was running short of clean water. The bodies had to be removed and buried to prevent disease. The walls had to be inspected and repaired where damaged, because the city was vulnerable to attack from anyone who might want to take advantage of the catastrophe. All of this was happening at the same time as the survivors were dealing with their personal losses and their terror. Because the aftershocks continued for days, and every new tremor sent people running into the open spaces with renewed panic, the most important decision made in the immediate aftermath was the one about communication. The Senate, or rather the remnant of it that had survived, authorized the dispatch of emergency letters to every Ragusan consul in every city where the Republic had representation. The letters were carefully worded. They acknowledged the catastrophe because denying it was impossible, but they also firmly stated that the Republic was functioning, that its obligations would be honored, that its credit was good, and that anyone who thought otherwise would be making a serious mistake. This was not merely reassurance. It was a strategic intervention in the commercial perception of the crisis, and it worked. The trading partners who received these letters, the Florentine banking houses that had Ragusan deposits on their books, the Ottoman merchants who had goods in transit through Ragusan warehouses, the Venetian companies that had commercial contracts with Ragusan firms. All of these parties made decisions in the days and weeks after the earthquake about whether to maintain their relationships with the city or to treat the disaster as a reason to withdraw. The letters and the consistency of Ragusan behavior in the months that followed persuaded most of them to maintain. The rebuilding of the city was a decades-long process. The resources required were enormous, and they were assembled through a combination of emergency borrowing, voluntary contributions from the Ragusan diaspora in the commercial cities of the interior and across Europe, and the gradual recovery of commercial revenues as the city's trading operations were restored. The process was managed by the reconstituted institutions of the Republic with the same systematic attention to detail that had always characterized Ragusan administration. The new buildings that replaced the destroyed ones were different from what they had replaced. The architectural style of the late 17th century was Baroque, more ornate and more theatrical than the Gothic and Renaissance forms that had characterized the pre-earthquake city. The new cathedral, built on the foundations of the old, was a larger and more imposing structure with a Baroque facade that proclaimed the city's continued cultural ambition. The rector's palace, rebuilt in its present form, showed in its architecture the influence of the Italian Baroque that had been transformed by the particular context of a small Adriatic city still recovering from catastrophe. The earthquake also had a demographic consequence that played out over the following decades. The noble families had been hit hardest, and they did not recover their pre-earthquake numbers. The tendency of the Ragusan nobility toward endogamy, the practice of marrying within the noble class rather than outside it, had been creating a gradually shrinking pool of potential spouses for decades before the earthquake. The earthquake accelerated this process dramatically. Noble families that had previously had multiple branches to carry on their names were reduced to single branches or extinguished altogether. The Great Council, which had sat perhaps 200 nobles before the earthquake, could gather only a fraction of that number in the years immediately after. This demographic crisis of the noble class was one of the structural challenges that the Republic would spend the remainder of its existence trying to manage. It created openings for the elevation of new families to noble status, a process that had previously been almost unthinkable in a system that prized the exclusivity of the governing class. It created pressures on the system of governance, because institutions designed for a certain critical mass of participants do not function well below that mass. And it created a subtle change in the psychological tone of the Republic, an awareness of finitude that had not previously been so present, a sense that the city was living on borrowed time. The last century and a half of the Republic's existence was not a story of decline in any simple sense. The institutions continued to function. The commercial network continued to operate, though at reduced scale. The city continued to be governed with the care and the intelligence that had always characterized its administration. But the context had changed in ways that were not reversible, and the changes pointed in a direction that the city's traditional approaches could not fully address. The world of the late 17th and 18th centuries was not the world in which the Republic of Ragusa had developed its survival strategies. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the aggressive, expanding power that it had been in the 15th and 16th centuries. It was still vast, still formidable, still capable of projecting military force across large distances, but it was showing the signs of structural difficulty that would deepen into the 19th century crisis that Europeans would call the Eastern Question. The empire was having trouble reforming its administrative and military institutions to meet the challenges of a changing world, and the gap between its aspirations and its capabilities was gradually widening. For Ragusa, this meant that the Ottoman relationship, which had been the cornerstone of the city's security strategy for more than 3 centuries, was becoming less critical to its survival. The Ottoman navy, which had once made the eastern Mediterranean genuinely dangerous for ships that did not carry Ottoman protection, was no longer the force it had been. The Habsburg Empire, which had been pushing back Ottoman power in the Balkans through a series of wars culminating in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, was now the dominant power in much of the territory that had previously been Ottoman, and the Habsburg attitude toward Ragusa was one of benign neglect rather than active threat. Venice was declining too. The great Maritime Republic, that had been Ragusa's oldest commercial rival and occasional overlord, was losing its commercial position to the Atlantic trade, its naval position to the Ottomans, and later to the Northern European maritime powers, and its political independence to the pressures that eventually brought it under French authority in 1797. The fall of Venice to Napoleon was a shock to the entire European world, a reminder that institutions, however old and however apparently stable, could be swept away by the force of a new kind of power. The cultural life of the Republic in the 18th century was, paradoxically, among the most accomplished in its history. The Baroque period of Ragusan literature, which had produced the dramatist Marin Drujic in the 16th century and the epic poet Ivan Gundulic in the early 17th, continued to generate writers of real quality. Gundulic's great poem Osman, an epic treatment of the Ottoman-Polish conflict of the early 17th century, written with considerable artistic ambition, was one of the most significant works of literature produced in the South Slavic tradition before the modern period. It was widely read, widely admired, and represented the kind of cultural achievement that the Republic's investment in education and learning over centuries had made possible. The writers and poets of the later period wrote with an elegiac awareness of the city's situation that gave their work a particular quality. They knew they were living in a diminished version of what their city had once been. They knew that the great age of commercial empire was over, but they also knew that what Ragusa had accomplished over its centuries of existence was genuinely remarkable, and they wanted to record and celebrate that accomplishment before time and circumstance erased it. There is in their writing a quality of deliberate memory-making, of people who understand that they are at the end of something and want to ensure that the something is not forgotten. The political life of the Republic, in its final decades, was complicated by the French Revolutionary Wars, which were changing the map of Europe with a speed and thoroughness that no previous conflict had achieved. The French armies that swept through Italy in the 1790s, destroying the old states and creating new ones, were not operating by any of the principles that the Republic of Ragusa had been using to navigate the world for centuries. They did not respond to tribute payments. They did not value neutrality for its own sake. They did not have the patience to maintain the kind of long-term relationship that the Ragusan diplomatic approach required. The Republic tried its traditional approaches. It sent diplomats to Napoleon's court. It expressed its neutrality in the most formal terms. It offered the kind of commercial utility that had served it well with every previous great power. Napoleon was not interested. He was not interested in a neutral Adriatic trading city. He was interested in military control of the Adriatic, and Ragusa's harbour was a strategic asset that he wanted to control directly. The French occupation of 1806 was conducted in stages, with enough diplomatic cover to allow the Republic to pretend, briefly, that it was maintaining its formal status while accommodating a French military presence. But the pretense did not hold. In January 1808, General Marmont issued the decree formally abolishing the Republic. The territory was incorporated into the French Illyrian provinces. The Great Council of Ragusa met for the last time. The last rector presided over the dissolution with the dignity that the institution required. The records were secured, the decision was accepted, and the Republic, which had existed in one form or another since the earliest days of the settlement on the limestone rock, was over. The men who governed Ragusa were not saints. They were merchants and lawyers and administrators who had grown up in a particular city with a particular set of institutional arrangements and a particular understanding of what those arrangements were for. They had been educated in the city's schools, trained in its legal traditions, formed by the competitive social world of the noble class, with its intricate hierarchies and its marriage alliances and its constant negotiation of status and precedence. They understood power in the way that people understand power when they have spent their lives in close proximity to it. What distinguished them collectively from the governing classes of many other medieval cities was not their individual virtue, but their institutional discipline. The system they operated within was designed to channel individual ambition into collective service, to make the pursuit of personal advancement dependent on the performance of public duty. A nobleman who wanted to rise in the esteem of his peers had to demonstrate competence in the public roles that the Republic assigned him. He had to serve well as a customs official, or as a judge, or as an ambassador, or in any of the dozens of administrative positions that the government of a small but complex republic required filling. His advancement depended on the reputation he built in those roles, and his reputation depended on how well he served the collective interest. This was not a perfect system. There was corruption, as there is corruption in all human systems. There was nepotism, as there is nepotism wherever families have influence and public offices are distributed by members of those families. There were occasions when the self-interest of powerful noble clans distorted the public decision-making in ways that were not in the city's best interest. The historical record is honest enough about these failures that we do not need to pretend they did not occur, but the system had mechanisms for responding to its own failures. The public accountability of officials, the rotation of officers, the oversight of the Senate and the Great Council over the actions of individual administrators, the legal procedures through which citizens who had been wronged could seek redress. All of these created a set of checks on the worst expressions of individual self-interest that, while not infallible, worked well enough over the long run to maintain the basic trustworthiness of the Republic's institutions. The trust that the institutions generated was not just important domestically, it was the foundation of the city's commercial success internationally. When a Florentine banking house deposited funds with a Ragusan merchant, or when an Ottoman silk dealer consigned goods to a Ragusan trading house for transport to the Western markets, or when a Spanish nobleman commissioned a Ragusan captain to carry a cargo from Lisbon to Palermo, the transaction rested ultimately on a belief that the Ragusan party to the transaction would behave in good faith, and that if he did not, there was a legal system that would provide redress. This belief was earned over generations of reliable behavior, and it was more valuable than any single transaction or any temporary commercial advantage. The commercial reputation of a trading city is an asset that compounds over time, each reliable transaction adding incrementally to the stock of trust that makes the next transaction possible, each failure of reliability subtracting from it. Ragusa managed its commercial reputation with the same systematic attention that it managed its diplomatic relationships, understanding that both were forms of institutional capital that required constant maintenance and that could be destroyed much more quickly than they could be built. The roads that connected Ragusa to its inland trading empire were one of the city's most important practical investments, and understanding them is essential to understanding how the city's commercial system actually worked in practice. The coastal road ran north and south along the Dalmatian coast, connecting Ragusa to the other towns of the coast and to the northern Dalmatian cities that were further up the Adriatic. But this road, for all its importance, was not the road that defined Ragusa's commercial identity. The road that mattered, the road that separated Ragusa from every other coastal city in the region, was the road that went inland. The Balkan interior in the medieval period was not a void. It was a complex landscape of cities and towns, mining communities and agricultural villages, trade routes and river crossings that had been developing since Roman times, and that continued to develop throughout the medieval period, even as the political authority over it changed hands repeatedly. The key to the interior was the road network, and the key road for Ragusa ran from the harbour through the mountains behind the city and into Bosnia and Serbia. This road was not comfortable. The first section, Climbing from the coast up through the limestone ridges of the Dinaric Alps was the hardest, a steep climb through terrain that gave good pack horses serious work to do. In winter, ice and snow made sections of the road genuinely dangerous. In summer, the heat reflected from the limestone could be punishing, and throughout the year, the bandits who found the isolated stretches of mountain road congenial to their profession had to be managed, which meant either paying for military escorts or accepting the losses that occasional raids imposed. But the road worked. Caravans moved up and down it throughout the year, carrying silver and copper down to the coast and cloth and spices, and manufactured goods up to the interior. The caravans were substantial operations, organized by the merchants and conducted by the teamsters and muleteers who made their living moving goods through the mountains. A major caravan might include dozens of pack animals and their handlers, plus guards, plus the merchant's own agents who supervised the cargo and negotiated its passage through the various jurisdictions it crossed. The merchants who organized these caravans were in many cases not Ragusan nobles, but Ragusan citizens of non-noble status, the craftspeople and merchants who made up the city's commercial middle class. Some of these men were extraordinarily capable commercial operators who built businesses that spanned the entire Ragusan trading network. They were not, by the Republic's constitution, eligible for political office, but they were economically essential, and the Republic knew it, providing them with the legal protections and the diplomatic backing that their operations required. A typical interior merchant might have his headquarters in one of the Bosnian or Serbian commercial towns, where he maintained a warehouse and a small staff of agents and clerks. He would have accounts with the Ragusan banking houses on the coast, through which he settled his transactions with merchants in Italy and the wider Mediterranean world. He would have relationships with the local mine owners and the local rulers, carefully maintained through gifts and reliable dealing that gave him reliable access to the goods he needed to buy. And he would have a network of contacts extending across the entire arc of the Ragusan commercial empire, from London to Alexandria, that allowed him to know where demand was high and prices were good. These men were in many ways the most interesting people in the Ragusan commercial world, more interesting in some respects than the noble families who governed the Republic. They were operating in conditions of considerable uncertainty and considerable danger, far from the institutional protections of the city, relying on their own judgment and their own relationships to navigate circumstances that could change rapidly and unpredictably. The records they left in the letters and commercial accounts that have survived in the Ragusan archives show minds of considerable sharpness and considerable pragmatism, people who understood their world in granular, specific, practical terms. The letter from a Ragusan merchant in Sarajevo to his partner in Dubrovnik in the 1480s, describing the condition of the silver market and the mood of the local Ottoman administrator, and the state of the road through the mountains, and the prices being offered for Florentine cloth by competing merchants from Ancona, is not a document of high literature, but it is a document of high intelligence, the intelligence of someone who is paying very close attention to a complex situation and communicating what they see with clarity and precision to someone who needs that information to make good decisions. This is the texture of what Ragusa actually was, not the walls and the rector's palace and the Baroque churches, though those are real and beautiful and worth seeing. The texture of what Ragusa actually was is in the letters and the accounts and the legal documents, in the specific, particular, unglamorous work of people doing their jobs carefully in circumstances that did not make that easy. The consul system that the Republic maintained across its trading world was one of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations of the medieval and early modern period, and it deserves considerably more attention than it usually receives in the popular accounts of Ragusan history that focus on the walls and the picturesque cityscape. A Ragusan consul was not what a modern consul is. He was typically a Ragusan merchant already resident in the foreign city, who had been formally designated by the Senate to represent the Republic's interests and who was paid for this service, sometimes in cash and sometimes in the form of reduced duties on his own commercial operations. He was responsible for protecting Ragusan citizens in legal disputes. which meant knowing the local legal system and knowing how to navigate it on behalf of people who might not speak the language or understand the procedures. He was responsible for maintaining the relationship with local authorities, which meant attending to the cultivation of those authorities with the gifts and the attentions that such cultivation required. And he was responsible for reporting to the Senate in Ragusa on conditions in his city. The reports that the consuls sent back to Ragusa were the lifeblood of the Senate's decision-making. They covered everything that a governing body needed to know about the external environment in which the city was operating. The commercial conditions. What goods were in demand, what prices were being offered, what the credit conditions were, which merchants were reliable and which were not. The political conditions. Which ruler was in the ascendant, what military preparations were visible, what the mood of the court was, what was being said in the marketplace about the intentions of the various powers, the social conditions, what diseases were circulating, what the harvest had been like, what the general level of prosperity or distress was in the population. The quality of this information varied, as all intelligence does. Some consuls were more observant and more analytical than others. Some were better connected to the information networks of their city, and some were more peripheral. Some had access to court circles, and some did not. The Senate was aware of this variation and calibrated its reliance on individual reports accordingly, comparing what different sources said about the same situation and noting the discrepancies. But the system as a whole was genuinely remarkable in its scope and its consistency. At the height of the Republic's commercial expansion, Ragusan consuls were present in perhaps 30 or 40 cities simultaneously, from London to Alexandria, from Lisbon to Constantinople to the cities of the Black Sea coast. The flow of information that this network produced was extraordinary, a constant stream of specific, current, actionable intelligence about conditions across the entire arc of the Mediterranean world and beyond. This intelligence advantage had commercial implications that are relatively easy to see. A merchant who knew before his competitors that the cloth market in Constantinople was undersupplied, or that the silver market in Venice was glutted, or that a drought in Egypt was about to drive up grain prices, could position himself to profit from these conditions in ways that less well-informed competitors could not. The first mover advantage in any commercial situation is real and substantial, and Ragusa consistently had better information than its competitors about where the first mover advantages were to be found. But the intelligence advantage also had diplomatic and strategic implications that go beyond the commercial. A government that knew, in advance, what the major powers around it were planning, what their current strengths and weaknesses were, what internal pressures were shaping their behavior, was in a position to respond to those plans and that behavior in ways that maximized its own freedom of action. It could detect threats early enough to mount a response before the threat materialized. It could identify opportunities for diplomatic maneuver before those opportunities closed. And it could present itself to the powers around it as a reliable and well-informed partner whose understanding of the situation could be valuable to them, which was itself a form of leverage. The Ottoman court valued the Ragusans precisely because of their information. The Ottoman administrators in the Balkans, the Grand Viziers in Istanbul, the local Sanjak Beys in the territories where Ragusan merchants operated, all understood that the Ragusan commercial network was a pipeline of information about the Western Mediterranean world and the affairs of the Christian powers. Information that the Ottomans found genuinely useful, and the Ragusans understood this valuation and used it, carefully sharing certain categories of information with the Ottoman court as a way of cementing the relationship, while being careful never to share anything that would materially harm the other relationships they were maintaining. Simultaneously, this is sophisticated diplomatic tradecraft of a high order. It requires not just the capacity to gather information, but the judgment to know what to do with it, when to share and when to withhold, how to use the leverage that information provides, without overplaying it and destroying the relationships that make the information gathering possible in the first place. The Ragusans practiced this craft for generations, refining it through experience and passing it on through the institutional culture of the Senate and the diplomatic training that noble sons received as part of their preparation for public service. The ships that carried Ragusan goods and Ragusan merchants across the Mediterranean and beyond were themselves an important part of the Republic's strategic asset base, and they deserve some attention on their own. The great age of Ragusan shipbuilding coincided with the height of the city's commercial prosperity in the 14th and 15th centuries. The forests of the Dalmatian hinterland, particularly the oak forests that gave the Croatian name to the city itself, provided excellent raw material for shipbuilding. Ragusan shipwrights developed techniques and designs that were competitive with the best in the Mediterranean world, producing vessels that were fast, well-built, and capable of carrying substantial cargoes over long distances. The argosy was the characteristic large Ragusan merchant vessel, a term that appears in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice as a word for a large merchant ship, and that derives, some scholars believe, from the name Ragusa itself. An argosy was typically a large, round-hulled cargo ship, slow but capacious, capable of carrying several hundred tons of goods over the long trading routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast of Europe. These were the workhorses of the Ragusan commercial fleet, the vessels that carried the silver from the Balkan mines to the Italian banking cities and the cloth from Flanders to the Levant. For faster work, the Ragusans also operated smaller, more nimble vessels, galleys and brigantines, and various intermediate types, suited to the coastal trade and to the short hops between the Dalmatian islands and the mainland ports. The harbour of Ragusa maintained a diversity of vessel types because the city's trading operations required a diversity of capabilities, from the brute cargo capacity of the large ocean-going ships to the quick manoeuvring ability of the small coastal craft. The men who sailed these ships were among the most experienced mariners in the Mediterranean world. The Dalmatian coast produced sailors with a particular combination of qualities: the navigational skill that comes from sailing in the complicated waters of the Adriatic, where the coastline is intricate and the winds are unpredictable, and the limestone islands create hazards that require constant attention, combined with the deep water experience that came from the long voyages to England and Flanders and the Levant and North Africa. Ragusan sailors were in demand across the Mediterranean shipping industry, and many of them found employment on the ships of other nations when the Ragusan fleet had no immediate need of their services. The sailors themselves were organized in the hierarchies that maritime commerce required. The captain was the master of the ship in all matters of navigation and seamanship. The merchants who owned the cargo were often aboard, or represented by agents who travelled with the goods. The crew was hired for the voyage, drawn from the pool of experienced mariners that the city and the surrounding coast produced. The conditions of service were regulated, at least in principle, by the city's maritime law, which specified the obligations of both captains and crew, and provided mechanisms for resolving the disputes that inevitably arise when people are confined in a small space for weeks at a time. The life of a Ragusan sailor in the great trading age was hard by any comfortable standard, but not without its rewards. The pay, when it came, was real. The ports that the ships visited were among the most interesting places in the known world. Istanbul and Alexandria and Lisbon and London and all the intermediate ports offered a variety of human experience that no land-bound existence could match. The sailors who survived the hazards of the sea, the storms and the pirates and the navigational dangers, came home with experience, and sometimes with money, and always with stories. And the stories mattered. The sailors who returned from long voyages brought back information that the Senate needed, information about conditions in foreign ports, about the ships they had encountered and the cargo those ships were carrying, about the mood and the policies of the authorities in the cities they had visited. The formal consul network was supplemented by this informal intelligence, the collective observation of hundreds of sailors making hundreds of voyages and bringing back what they had seen. The Jewish community that established itself in Ragusa in the late medieval and early modern period was another piece of the complex social mosaic that the Republic managed with its characteristic, pragmatic attention. Jews had lived in Dalmatia since ancient times, and they had been a presence in the Adriatic trading cities throughout the medieval period. In Ragusa, the Jewish community occupied a complex position. The Republic was formerly a Christian commonwealth, and the pressures of Catholic orthodoxy that bore on all Christian polities in Europe meant that the open practice of Judaism was a matter of negotiation rather than simply a matter of rights. The Ragusans negotiated. They did what they did with everything. They found a practical accommodation that allowed them to benefit from what the Jewish community could offer while maintaining their formal Christian credentials. The Jewish quarter of Ragusa, the ghetto that was established in 1546, was not a comfortable place by any standard. Its inhabitants faced restrictions on their economic activities, on their freedom of movement, on the circumstances of their daily lives. These restrictions were real, and they were enforced. But the Jewish community was tolerated, and in certain respects protected, because it was useful. Jewish merchants had commercial networks that complemented the Ragusan networks in useful ways, particularly in the Ottoman Empire, where Jewish communities had established significant commercial presence. The financial skills and the commercial connections that the Jewish community brought were valuable to a city whose commercial ambitions required every available resource. The relationship was never simple and never fully comfortable from either side. The Jewish community in Ragusa lived under constraints that members of the Christian community did not face. And those constraints were not just formal, but practical, shaping daily life in ways that were demeaning by any standard. But they also lived under the protection of the Republic's law, which was consistently applied and which provided real recourse against the worst expressions of popular hostility. The accommodation that Ragusa made with its Jewish community was, in its way, characteristic of the broader approach the Republic took to managing internal diversity and external difference. Not idealism, not the assertion of principles that the actual circumstances could not support, but practical management, the finding of arrangements that allowed different groups to coexist and to contribute to the collective enterprise, without requiring perfect equality or perfect harmony. The medical history of Ragusa is one of the more remarkable aspects of its institutional life, and it reflects the same combination of practical intelligence and institutional capacity that characterized the city's approach to everything. The Black Death that swept through Europe in the late 1340s and returned repeatedly over the following century was the great medical catastrophe of the medieval period. It killed between 1/3 of Europe's population in its initial outbreak, and subsequent outbreaks continued to take significant tolls across the continent for the next several centuries. For a trading city like Ragusa, always in contact with ships from across the Mediterranean world, the plague presented a particular and constant danger. The city's response to this danger was to create, in the late 14th century, one of the earliest systematic public health regimes in European history. The quarantine system that Ragusa developed, formalized in the 1377 law that required ships from plague-affected areas to wait offshore before landing, was not the product of a sophisticated medical theory of disease transmission. The germ theory of disease would not be developed for another 4 centuries. But the Ragusans had observed, and their observation was correct, that plague seemed to be associated with particular ships and particular people and particular goods, and that if you could separate the potentially contaminated from the rest of the population for long enough, many outbreaks could be prevented. The 40-day waiting period that eventually became the standard, giving us the word quarantine from the Italian quaranta, was chosen empirically based on observations of how long it typically took for plague symptoms to manifest in exposed individuals. It was the right duration, approximately correct from the perspective of modern epidemiology, and it saved lives. The quarantine system was administered with the same systematic attention to detail that characterized Ragusan administration generally. The inspectors who went out to examine arriving ships were trained for the purpose. The records of which ships had been quarantined and what had been observed during the quarantine period were kept carefully. The penalties for violations of the quarantine rules were real and were enforced, and the Senate reviewed the system periodically and made adjustments based on experience, in the same way that it reviewed and adjusted its commercial and diplomatic policies. The city also developed more general public health measures that went beyond quarantine. The water supply system was maintained to a standard that minimized contamination. The disposal of waste was regulated. The markets were inspected for the quality of goods being sold. The hospitals maintained by the city provided care for the sick, regardless of their social status. And the pharmacy at the Franciscan monastery, operating since 1317, provided medicines to the population at a cost that most people could manage. None of this prevented all outbreaks of plague or other epidemic diseases. Ragusa suffered plague multiple times over the centuries, and each outbreak took lives and disrupted the life of the city. But the systematic public health approach meant that the city generally fared better than communities without such systems, that outbreaks were more often contained than they might otherwise have been, and that the disruption to commercial and civic life, though real, was managed rather than simply endured. The public health investments also had commercial significance. A city that was known to manage plague better than its competitors was a city that merchants felt safer visiting and doing business in. The quarantine system, while it imposed short-term costs on arriving merchants who had to wait offshore before landing, also provided them with the assurance that the city they were about to enter was as safe from plague as it was possible to make it. That assurance had commercial value. The legal profession in Ragusa deserves its own consideration, because it was one of the instruments through which the Republic's institutional sophistication expressed itself in the most practical and concrete ways. The lawyers who served the Republic were trained in the Roman and Byzantine legal tradition that the city had inherited and developed. They were experts in the codified law of the Statute of Ragusa, in the commercial law that governed the city's trading operations, in the diplomatic law that regulated its relations with other polities, and in the ecclesiastical law that governed its relationship with the church. They were, in other words, the kind of broadly trained legal professionals who were necessary to run a sophisticated republic in a complex world. The role that these lawyers played went beyond the obvious functions of representing clients in disputes and advising officials on the law. They were also the people who drafted the city's commercial agreements, its diplomatic treaties, its internal regulations. The precision and care with which Ragusan legal documents were constructed reflected the understanding that in a world where you could not always rely on the goodwill of the parties to honor their agreements, the precision of the agreement itself was a form of protection. A commercial agreement, drafted with sufficient precision, left little room for the kind of creative reinterpretation that a bad faith party might attempt. A diplomatic treaty whose terms were carefully specified was harder to violate on technicalities than one whose terms were vague. The legal precision of Ragusan documents was not pedantry. It was a defensive strategy, the use of language as a form of fortification, as real in its protective function as the stone walls that surrounded the city. The legal training that Ragusan nobles received as part of their preparation for public service meant that the men who governed the Republic had a level of legal literacy that was relatively unusual in the governing classes of medieval Europe. They understood contracts, they understood procedure, they understood the relationship between law and power and the ways in which legal arguments could be used to defend positions that purely military or economic arguments could not sustain. This legal literacy was part of what made the city's diplomacy so effective, because a diplomat who understood law could make arguments that a diplomat who did not understand it could not make. And in a world where the emerging framework of international relations was being constructed primarily through legal instruments and legal precedents, the ability to make good legal arguments was a significant asset. The aristocratic families that governed Ragusa over its centuries of existence were not a static group. They changed over time, as families died out and new ones were elevated, as the economic and demographic circumstances of the city shifted. But certain family names appear again and again in the records, and tracing the histories of these families gives you a sense of how the governing class of the Republic actually worked. The Gunduliks were one of the most prominent noble families across the long span of Ragusan history. They produced senators and rectors and ambassadors over generations, and their collective service constitutes a kind of institutional memory in human form. The accumulated knowledge and skill of a family that had been doing this work for centuries. The poet Ivan Gundulik, whose epic Osman is the greatest literary achievement of the Ragusan tradition, was a member of this family. A reminder that the cultivation of letters was not separate from the cultivation of governance in the Ragusan understanding of what a noble life required. The The Bobalis were another prominent family, prominent in both the commercial and the political life of the city. The records of their commercial operations, which survive in some detail in the city's archives, show the sophisticated commercial practices that the great Ragusan merchant families had developed. The careful management of risk through the distribution of cargo across multiple ships, the use of financial instruments to move value without moving physical goods, the maintenance of the complex network of relationships that made large-scale trading possible. The Sorkosevics, the Menzatiches, the Ranginas, the Dryhish, these family names recur throughout the political and commercial and cultural history of the Republic, each of them representing a lineage that had invested in the city's success over generations and had built up, through that investment, a stake in its continuation. The commitment of the noble class to the Republic was not simply ideological, it was deeply material. Their wealth, their status, their way of life, all depended on the continued functioning of the institution. They had every practical reason to defend it and to serve it well. But the noble families were not the whole of Ragusan society, and the non-noble majority of the population was not a passive backdrop to the dramas of the governing class. The guilds, the religious brotherhoods, the craft associations, the merchant associations of the non-noble citizens all had their own internal structures and their own ways of organizing collective action. They petitioned the Senate. They maintained their own charitable funds. They organized the festivals and the processions that marked the city's ceremonial life. They were, in the vocabulary of the period, subjects of the Republic rather than its governors. But they were active participants in its life, not merely its recipients. The relationship between the noble governors and the non-noble majority was maintained partly by the general prosperity that the Republic's commercial success produced, which gave the non-noble majority a material stake in the continuation of the system, and partly by the legal protections that the Republic's law provided, which applied to everyone within the city's jurisdiction and not just to the nobility. It was also maintained by the elaborate ceremonial life of the city, in which different social groups had defined roles that gave them a place in the public drama of the community's identity. This is not to say that the relationship was without tension. The non-noble citizens periodically pressed for greater political participation. There were moments of genuine social conflict, usually triggered by specific grievances rather than by abstract demands for equality. The Republic managed these tensions with the same practical intelligence it applied to its external relationships, conceding enough to reduce the pressure without conceding so much as to change the fundamental structure of the system. The geography of the Ragusan commercial empire, the spatial pattern of where Ragusan merchants operated and what routes they used, was not random. It was the product of centuries of exploration and calculation, shaped by the particular goods that Ragusa dealt in, and the particular relationships that the city had built, and the particular capabilities that its merchant fleet possessed. The core of the network was always the Adriatic Balkans axis, the connection between the harbour of Ragusa and the trading cities and mining towns of the interior. This was the foundation, the trade that had made the city prosperous in the first place, and that remained central to its commercial life throughout the great centuries. Silver and copper moving out, cloth and spices moving in. The mechanics of this trade, the caravans and the mountain roads, and the interior trading posts were described earlier, but the sheer scale and duration of this operation deserves emphasis. From the time the Ragusan merchants first established their trading posts in the Bosnian and Serbian interior in the 13th century, to the time those posts were wound down as Ottoman administration changed the commercial landscape in the 16th century, that is approximately 3 centuries of continuous commercial operation in one of the more difficult terrains in Europe. The persistence required was remarkable, as was the institutional capacity to maintain commercial relationships and legal arrangements across multiple generations and multiple changes of political authority in the host territories. Beyond the Balkans core, the network extended in 2 primary directions, northward and westward, along the Adriatic coast and beyond, connecting to the major Italian commercial cities, Florence, Venice, Ancona, Genoa, beyond Italy, to the cloth-producing cities of Flanders and the wool-producing sheep runs of England. These northern connections were primarily about cloth, the most important commodity in the medieval long-distance trade, and about the financial services that the Italian banking houses provided. Southward and eastward, the network connected to the Ottoman and Mediterranean world. Istanbul, Alexandria, Beirut, the ports of the Levant, North Africa, the Black Sea ports through which goods from the Asian trade routes entered the Mediterranean system. These connections were primarily about the luxury goods of the Eastern trade and about the Mediterranean agricultural products, wine and oil, and grain and dried fruits, that moved in large quantities between the producing regions and the consuming cities. At its greatest extent, the Ragusan commercial network was one of the most geographically comprehensive trading operations in the European world. It was not the largest. Venice and Genoa and Florence all operated at greater scale, but it was remarkably consistent given the small size of the city that organized it, and it was more deeply embedded in certain markets, particularly the Balkan interior and the Ottoman territories, than any competitor managed to achieve. The language question in Ragusa is one of the more interesting aspects of its cultural history, because the city operated in multiple languages simultaneously in a way that reflected its position at the intersection of multiple cultural worlds. The formal language of the Republic's institutions was Latin. The Statute of 1272 was written in Latin. The minutes of the Senate were kept in Latin. The diplomatic correspondence with the papacy and with the Western Christian powers was conducted in Latin. The legal proceedings of the courts were in Latin. This was the language of administration and law throughout the Western European world in the medieval period, and Ragusa's use of it was both a practical necessity and a signal of its participation in the Latin Christian tradition of civilization. But Latin was not the only language. The Slavic languages that the majority of the population spoke in their daily lives were present from the earliest period of the city's existence, growing in importance as the Slavic community on the mainland became integrated with the Latin-speaking community on the rocky promontory. By the 14th century, Croatian, or the local variety of South Slavic that would develop into Croatian, was the language of the streets and the markets and the homes of most people in the city, noble and non-noble alike. The noble class navigated between these languages with the ease of people who have grown up doing so. They wrote their administrative documents in Latin and their love poetry in the vernacular. They conducted their diplomatic negotiations in Latin or Italian depending on which power they were addressing, and they spoke Croatian when they were at home with their families. The multilingualism was not a burden, it was a resource. Italian, specifically the Venetian dialect of Italian, that was the lingua franca of the Adriatic trading world, was the language of commerce in the Adriatic context. Ragusan merchants dealing with Venetian or other Italian counterparts communicated in Italian. The commercial correspondence of the city, the letters between the Ragusan trading houses and their Italian counterparts, was conducted in Italian. This linguistic competence was part of what made the Ragusans effective commercial partners for the Italian merchant world. And then there was Turkish, which the Ragusan merchants who operated in the Ottoman territories needed to function, at least at the basic commercial level. The more senior officials who maintained relationships with the Ottoman court needed more sophisticated Turkish, the formal and flowery language of court communication that was quite different from the marketplace Turkish that a merchant needed to buy and sell. Some Ragusan diplomats were accomplished Turkish speakers, and this competence was valued and cultivated by the Republic. The linguistic diversity of Ragusan professional life is a measure of the cosmopolitan character of the city's elite. These were people who moved easily between different cultural worlds, who could read the conventions and the expectations of different societies and adapt their behavior accordingly. This cultural flexibility was not just pleasant, it was operationally essential for people who were conducting diplomacy and commerce with parties from radically different cultural backgrounds. The way the Republic understood and responded to time, to the long-term consequences of short-term decisions, was perhaps its most distinctive intellectual quality. Most political actors, in most periods of history, operate primarily on short time horizons. The pressures of the immediate situation, the demands of current relationships, the threats and opportunities that are visible right now, tend to dominate the attention of decision-makers who have limited time and limited information, and who face consequences that are near-term and concrete. Long-term thinking is difficult and often unrewarded, because the person who plants a tree usually does not live to sit in its shade, and the politician who accepts a short-term cost to secure a long-term benefit usually faces the cost, but may not be around for the benefit. The Republic of Ragusa found a partial institutional solution to this problem. The secrecy of the Senate's deliberations and the long continuity of the institution's strategic approach meant that the Senate could take positions and pursue policies that would be incomprehensible or even offensive in the short term. But that made sense in the context of a long-term strategy that was understood only inside the institution. When the Senate agreed to pay a tribute to the Ottoman Sultan that many Christian observers found disgraceful, it was acting on a calculation that accepting the short-term humiliation was the price of the long-term security that the Ottoman relationship provided. When it maintained its neutrality in wars that other Christian cities felt compelled to join, it was accepting the short-term reputation cost in exchange for the long-term advantage of remaining a trusted intermediary for all parties. These trade-offs between short-term costs and long-term benefits are the kinds of trade-offs that individual leaders facing immediate political pressures often cannot make. Institutions, which have longer lives and greater continuity than any individual, and which maintain their strategic commitments across changes of personnel, can make them. The Republic of Ragusa was structured to make them, and the payoff over 4.5 centuries was extraordinary. The long-term orientation also expressed itself in the city's approach to the physical infrastructure of its survival. The walls that were maintained and extended over centuries were not built in a single generation's response to a single threat. They were the product of a strategic commitment made again and again across generations to maintaining the physical preconditions of the city's independence. Each generation that contributed to the walls was investing in a future that would benefit its children and grandchildren more than itself. The institutional culture of the Republic made it possible to sustain that kind of intergenerational investment over the timescales required. The water supply system was another expression of this long-term orientation. The great aqueduct that brought water to the city from the springs in the hills above was not built because there was an immediate water crisis. It was built because the people who governed the city understood that a trading city that depended on unreliable local water sources was vulnerable in ways that a city with a reliable water supply was not. The investment was made in advance of the crisis it was designed to prevent. This is the kind of governance that is easy to undervalue because it is preventive rather than responsive. Because the crises it avoids are invisible, while the crises it responds to are not. The historian, who looks for the dramatic moments in Ragusan history, finds plenty of them. But the more important story is often the one without drama. The generations of careful maintenance and intelligent anticipation that prevented the dramatic moments from becoming catastrophes. The decline that set in after the earthquake of 1667 was not swift. It was the kind of decline that is easy to miss in the moment, because the institutions continue to function and the daily life of the city continues. And it is only in retrospect that the trajectory becomes clear. The population that the city struggled to rebuild after the earthquake never quite reached the pre-earthquake numbers in the noble class. The demographic mathematics of a closed, endogamous, hereditary elite are always unfavorable over the long run, and the earthquake accelerated the unfavorable trajectory. Family after family died out, their names surviving in the historical record, but not in living descendants. The Great Council, that had once been the room where the collective judgment of a substantial class of educated and experienced men was brought to bear on the city's problems, was becoming a smaller and older room. The commercial network adapted, as it always adapted, to the changed circumstances of the post-earthquake period. The scale was smaller, the ambition was more modest, but the fundamental orientation, the use of intelligence and relationships and legal arrangements to maintain commercial presence across a wide geographic area, remained. Ragusan merchants continued to operate in the Ottoman territories. The consul network continued to function. The ships continued to sail. The cultural life of the Republic in the 18th century had a particular quality that is worth dwelling on. It was the culture of a community that was aware of being at the end of something, and that responded to that awareness not with despair, but with a kind of heightened attentiveness to what it had been and what it had accomplished. The writers and scholars of this period were not producing new political theories or new commercial strategies. They were recording, celebrating, and trying to understand the long arc of the city's history. The chronicle tradition, which had always been a feature of Ragusan intellectual life, became more prominent and more self-conscious in the later period. Writers compiled the city's history from the earliest records, traced the development of its institutions, celebrated the diplomatic achievements of earlier generations, and mourned the losses. There was, in this activity, a quality of deliberate archive building, of people who understood that they were creating the record from which future generations would understand what the Republic had been. This self-awareness gave the cultural life of later Ragusa a melancholy depth that the more vigorous periods perhaps lacked. The great commercial age had the quality of something lived in the present tense, oriented toward the next voyage and the next negotiation and the next opportunity. The later period had the quality of something lived in the past tense, oriented toward understanding and recording what had already been accomplished. Neither quality is better than the other, but they are different, and the transition from one to the other is one of the ways in which the Republic's decline expressed itself in the cultural register. The city also faced, in the 18th century, the challenge of maintaining its commercial and institutional character in a world where the context was changing faster than it had ever changed before. The Atlantic trade was redirecting commercial energy away from the Mediterranean. The rise of Northern European maritime powers, England and the Netherlands especially, was shifting the balance of commercial power in ways that disadvantaged Mediterranean trading cities generally. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the economic dynamo it had been. Its commercial markets were important but shrinking relative to the world as a whole. The Republic responded with the resilience that had always characterized it, finding niches in the changing commercial landscape, maintaining relationships, adapting its operations. But the adaptations were incremental rather than transformative, and the world was changing in ways that required transformation rather than adaptation to remain competitive. By the time Napoleon's armies were remaking the map of Europe in the 1790s and early 1800s, Ragusa was a small, aging city whose institutions were functioning, but whose commercial importance had declined substantially from the heights of the 15th century. It was a relic, though a functioning and well-maintained one. And relics, however beautiful and however historically significant, do not have much leverage against the armies of a conquering general. The French occupation was conducted with the mixture of ideological posturing and hard-nosed strategic calculation that characterized French imperial expansion in this period. The language of liberation, of freeing the people from their aristocratic governors, was deployed alongside the straightforward calculation that Ragusa's harbour was strategically valuable and that the Republic's commercial network could be repurposed for French interests. The ideological argument found some reception among the non-noble majority of the city's population, who had been excluded from political participation for the entirety of the Republic's existence, and who were offered the prospect of a citizenship that the Republic had always denied them. The end, when it came, was without drama. The Great Council met. The resolution dissolving the Republic was passed. The records were secured. The last rector vacated the palace, and 4.5 centuries of self-government came quietly to its end. What is left is stone and story. The stone is still there, as stone has a way of remaining when everything else has changed. The walls still circle the city at their full height and their full breadth, the 45-meter width at the broadest points that was built not for ceremony but for war, for the mounting of artillery and the massing of soldiers in sufficient numbers to defend the perimeter. The Stradon still runs from gate to gate, worn smooth now by the feet of tourists rather than senators and merchants, but the same stone, the same axis, the same organizing spine of the city it has always been. The rector's palace is still there, its baroque facades a reminder of the rebuilding after the earthquake. Inside it, a museum now, where the portraits of the senators and the documents of the Senate are preserved behind glass for the visitors who come to understand what this place was. The cathedral is there, the Baroque structure that replaced what the earthquake destroyed, its treasury still holding the silver reliquary of Saint Blaise that the processions on the 1st of February have carried through the streets for centuries. The Franciscan monastery is still there, its 14th century cloister, one of the most beautiful spaces in the city, its pharmacy still operating in the tradition of the institution that has been serving the city's health since 13 and 17. The harbour is still there, quieter now than in the great days when the Ragusan merchant fleet numbered in the hundreds of ships, but still active. Still the connection between the city and the sea that has always defined it. And the story is still there, in the documents that the Republic preserved with such care over its centuries of existence, in the archives that hold the minutes of the Senate and the diplomatic correspondence and the legal records and the commercial accounts, in the chronicles written by the city's own historians who understood that what was happening around them was worth recording. The story is there, if you know how to read it. What does it tell us? That intelligence is a form of power, perhaps the most durable form of power, that institutions outlast individuals, and that building good institutions is therefore the most important thing a community can do. That survival is not a small achievement, that for a small community, surrounded by powerful and aggressive neighbours, to maintain its freedom and its coherence for more than 1,000 years requires something extraordinary in the character of the people and the quality of their collective arrangements. It tells us that neutrality, genuine and consistent neutrality, maintained across generations and defended against pressure from every direction, can be a form of strength rather than a form of weakness. That a small state, which makes itself genuinely useful to all parties in a conflict, can survive situations that would destroy a state that had committed itself to one side. It tells us that the abolition of injustice is possible, even when the whole world around you practices that injustice. That the collective moral judgment of a governing body can arrive at the right conclusion before history requires it to. And it tells us something about the relationship between freedom and the willingness to pay for it. Ragusa paid for its freedom in tribute money and in diplomatic humiliation, and in the constant effort of managing relationships with powers that could have destroyed the city at any moment. The payment was real. The freedom was also real. And over 4.5 centuries, the city decided again and again that the payment was worth it. That decision, made and remade again in the Senate of the Republic, across all those years, is the heart of the story. Not the beautiful walls, not the famous harbour, not the remarkable cultural life of the most prosperous periods, but the decision that freedom was worth whatever it cost to maintain it, and the sustained collective will to pay that cost without flinching. Walking the walls of Dubrovnik today, you can feel something of what that decision meant. The walls are wide, and the stone is warm, and the sea below is the colour that painters argue over, and the city inside the walls is still inhabited, still loved, still the home of people who have lived there their whole lives. The Republic is gone, the Senate no longer meets, but the walls it built are standing, and the story of why it built them and how it managed to protect what was inside them for so long is one of the most remarkable stories in the long history of human civilization. The lights of the city are warm against the dark of the Adriatic night. Somewhere on the Stradon, at whatever hour you are hearing this, the limestone is still smooth and white and ancient under feet that have walked it for 1,000 years. The sea moves as it always moves, without urgency, without judgment, patient, in the way that oceans are patient, and stones are patient, and only human beings are not. Rest now. The walls are standing. The story has been told. And the city that should not have survived, that had every reason to disappear into the general catastrophe of medieval and early modern Mediterranean history, is still there on its limestone shelf between the mountains and the sea, as impossible and as real as it has always been. There is one more dimension of the Ragusan story that deserves attention before we conclude, and that is the question of how the city understood itself. Not how it presented itself to the outside world, not the diplomatic performance of Christian orthodoxy and civic virtue that the Republic maintained for the benefit of observers, but how the people who lived inside the walls thought about their own community and their own place in history. The chronicles and the literary works of the Ragusan tradition give us access, imperfect and partial, as that access always is, to the self-understanding of the governing class. And what emerges from those sources is something more complex and more interesting than the official self-presentation would suggest. The Ragusans knew they were unusual. They knew that what they had built, a functioning republic that had survived for centuries in the middle of an extremely turbulent geopolitical environment, was not something that most communities managed to accomplish. They were proud of it, in the way that people who have worked very hard for a very long time to accomplish something difficult are allowed to be proud. The pride expressed itself in the care with which they maintained their institutions, in the attention they paid to the historical record, in the literary tradition that celebrated the city's achievements and mourned its losses. They were also, at some level, anxious. The anxiety is legible in the secrecy provisions of the Senate, which were not just about maintaining negotiating leverage, but also about protecting the city's decision-making from the interference of the more powerful entities around it. It is legible in the elaborate ceremonial life of the Republic, which was partly about social cohesion, but also about reassurance, about the regular affirmation that the city was still here, still functioning, still defined by the values and the practices that had always defined it. And it is legible in the constant attention to the external environment, the incessant intelligence gathering and diplomatic cultivation that the city practiced throughout its history, which was the behavioral expression of a community that knew it was vulnerable and could never afford to stop paying attention. This combination of pride and anxiety is one of the most human things about the Ragusan story. The pride was earned, the anxiety was rational, and the particular form that the city's political culture took. The elaborate institutions, the careful secrecy, the consistent neutrality, the long-term orientation was the expression of a community that had found a way to live with both. The Stradun at night, after the tourists have gone and the restaurants have closed and the last sounds of the evening have faded, is a different place from the Stradun in the middle of the day. The stone is the same, the buildings are the same, the proportions are the same, but the quality of the silence is different, not empty but full of the presence of everyone who has ever walked this street and everything they carried with them. The senators who walked it to their meetings with the weight of the city's survival on their minds. The merchants who walked it with their samples of cloth and their accounts to settle. The sailors who walked it with the salt of the Adriatic still on their skin, returning from voyages that had taken them to half the known world. The women who walked it every morning to the market, knowing the names of every vendor and every piece of gossip worth knowing. The children who played on it in the evenings, learning by running through it the geography of the city that was their home. They are all there in that silence, if you know how to listen for them. And what they are saying, what the silence of the Stradun at night communicates, is something very simple. We were here, we built this, we kept it. For as long as we could, and longer than anyone had a right to expect, we kept it. There are moments in the historical record where you can almost hear specific voices, where the careful archival prose of the diplomatic correspondence or the Senate minutes breaks down into something more personal and more direct. These moments are worth pausing on because they remind you that the city you are reading about was not an abstraction, but a place where specific people lived and worked and worried and hoped. There is a letter in the Ragusan archives, written in the early 16th century by a senator to his son, who was serving as a consul in Istanbul. The letter is partly administrative, covering the routine business of the consul's responsibilities. But near the end, the father writes something that is not administrative at all. He writes that he is old now, and that he has served the Republic for most of his adult life, and that he has sometimes wondered whether the service was worth the cost to his family and his personal life. And then he writes that he has concluded that it was, not because the Republic deserved it in any abstract sense, but because the freedom the Republic represented, the freedom to govern himself and his family and his community by rules that the community itself had made and could change, was worth whatever it cost to maintain it. This is not a heroic statement. It is not the stirring rhetoric of a warrior or a martyr. It is the quiet conclusion of a man who has done a long job carefully and who believes, on reflection, that the job mattered. And that quiet conclusion is, in many ways, the most honest expression of what the Republic of Ragusa actually was. There is also a letter written by a woman, rarer in the archives, because women had no formal role in the Republic's governance, and their correspondence was less likely to be preserved in the official record. She writes to her brother, who is away on a trading voyage, about the earthquake of 1667, which has happened recently and from which the city is still recovering. She describes the destruction, the deaths, the fear of the aftershocks, the difficulty of finding food and clean water in the days immediately after. And then she writes that she has seen, in the weeks of the recovery, something that she has never quite seen before. She has seen the city as a thing in itself, apart from any individual or any family. She has seen people who were strangers helping each other in ways that you only do when the ordinary structures of social life have been stripped away, and what remains is the bare fact of sharing a place and a fate. And she writes that she understands now, better than she did before, why the men in her family have spent their lives in service to this institution. Because the institution, she writes, is what makes the place more than just a collection of buildings, and the fate more than just the accident of where you happen to be born. These voices are rare in the historical record, and they are more valuable for their rarity. They remind you that the Republic of Ragusa was not just a story about geopolitics and commercial strategy and institutional design. It was also a story about human beings finding meaning in the shared project of building and maintaining a community, and discovering, sometimes only in the worst moments, that the project was worth the building. The Ottoman merchants who traded through Ragusan intermediaries knew something of this. The Florentine banking houses that deposited funds with Ragusan trading companies knew something of this. The sailors who returned to Ragusa after years at sea and walked down the Stradon to their homes knew something of this. Even the enemies of the Republic, the Venetian doges, who resented the city's commercial independence, and the Ottoman pashas, who occasionally thought about simply absorbing it, knew something of this. They knew that Ragusa was more than a city. It was a demonstration that a small community of people, given good institutions and the will to maintain them, could accomplish things that seemed impossible given its size and its circumstances. That demonstration is still there, in the walls and the streets and the archives. You can visit it, you can read it. You can, if you come at the right time, feel it in the silence of the Stradon after the tourists have gone and the city has returned to itself. The Habsburg period that followed the French interlude was less traumatic than the dissolution of the Republic had suggested it might be. The city continued to exist. The population continued to live their lives. The commercial activities that had always been the city's lifeblood continued in reduced form. The churches continued to hold their services. The festival of Street Blaze continued to be celebrated, as it still is today, but it was not the same. The governance of the city was now part of a larger administrative structure, the Habsburg Empire and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that was indifferent to the specific traditions and the specific character of what Ragusa had been. The local pride that the Republic had generated and maintained was not extinguished, but it no longer had institutional expression. The families whose ancestors had sat in the Great Council for generations were now simply the leading families of a provincial city, respected locally, but without the formal authority that the Republican Constitution had given their predecessors. The transition to Croatian national consciousness in the 19th century, as the South Slavic peoples moved toward the political movements that would eventually produce Yugoslavia and its successors, gave the city a new context and a new identity. The name Dubrovnik, the Croatian name, began to be used more consistently than the Italian Ragusa. The cultural heritage of the Republic was claimed as part of a specifically Croatian national tradition. The literature and the law and the civic achievements integrated into a story about the long history of a people who had maintained their cultural identity through centuries of foreign domination. This integration was, in some respects, natural. The city had always had a Croatian dimension, alongside its Latin and later Italian administrative tradition. The vernacular literature that the Republic had supported was Croatian literature. The people who had lived within the walls were, in the majority, Croatian speakers. The claim of the Croatian national tradition to this heritage had genuine historical foundation, but it was also, in some respects, a simplification. The Republic of Ragusa had not been a Croatian national institution. It had been a cosmopolitan institution, Latin in its legal tradition, Italian in its commercial language, Catholic in its religious identity, and multi-ethnic in its population. The noble class that had governed it was not simply Croatian. It was a specific, local aristocracy with its own complex heritage that did not fit neatly into any national category as that term came to be understood in the 19th century. The 19th and 20th centuries were not always kind to the city, any more than they were kind to most of the small cities and towns of southeastern Europe that found themselves caught between empires and between nationalisms, and between the catastrophic wars that reshaped the region. The First World War ended the Austro-Hungarian framework. The period between the wars brought the city into Yugoslavia. The Second World War brought occupation and resistance, and the complicated politics of a small city trying to survive in the middle of a conflict that was consuming much larger entities. The city survived all of this, as it had always survived, by continuing to exist and continuing to maintain what was worth maintaining. The walls did not fall, the archives were not destroyed, the churches continued to function, the Stradon continued to be walked. The most recent crisis, the shelling of the city during the Croatian War of Independence in 1991 and 1992, when Yugoslav army and naval forces bombarded the city from the surrounding heights and from the sea, was in some ways the most jarring because it brought modern military force against a city that had survived 500 years of medieval and early modern geopolitics by being smart enough never to be a military target. The shelling damaged buildings and killed people and reminded the world that Dubrovnik was still, despite everything, a place where real human beings lived and could suffer. The international response to the shelling, the horror and the condemnation from governments and cultural institutions around the world reflected the recognition that what was being attacked was not just a city, but a heritage. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which had listed the old city of Dubrovnik as a World Heritage Site in 1979, expressed that recognition in its original designation, and the international community's response to the 1,991 shelling reflected a widening sense that certain places that embody something important about human civilization, deserve special protection. The city was repaired after the shelling, the damaged buildings restored, the infrastructure rebuilt. It is again, today, one of the most visited historical cities in Europe, drawing millions of visitors every year who come to walk the walls and the Stradon and to see what it looks like, this place that survived so much. Some of those visitors know something about what they are seeing. Some of them have read about the Republic and understand, at least in outline, the extraordinary story of the city's survival. Others see the beauty and feel something in it without knowing quite what they are feeling. Both responses are valid. The beauty is real, and what the beauty is the surface expression of, the centuries of carefully maintained institutions and carefully cultivated relationships and carefully preserved records, is real too. The stone will outlast the understanding of it. The walls will stand when no one living remembers why they were built. But for now, tonight, the understanding is here. The story has been told. And somewhere in the warm silence of the Adriatic night, the city is still there on its limestone shelf, as impossible and as real and as stubbornly present as it has always been. The specific mechanisms through which the Republic maintained its commercial relationships across the enormous disruptions of the late medieval and early modern period deserve more detailed attention because they illuminate something important about how institutions preserve themselves through catastrophe. Consider the situation that the Republic faced in 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman armies of Mehmed II. For most of the Christian world, the fall of Constantinople was the end of something. The end of the Byzantine Empire, the end of the last living connection to the Roman world that had defined civilization for more than 1,000 years. The end, many contemporaries believed, of any realistic hope of containing Ottoman expansion in the Balkans and the Aegean. The emotional and psychological impact across the Christian world was profound. Chronicles from the period describe a shock that was almost physical, the sense that the ground of the familiar world had shifted beneath one's feet. For Ragusa, the fall of Constantinople was also the end of something, but it was also the beginning of something. The something it ended was the Byzantine commercial and cultural framework within which Ragusa had operated for centuries. The something it began was the Ottoman commercial and political relationship that would define the city's external situation for the next 3 centuries. The transition required a complete reorientation of the city's diplomatic posture, its commercial relationships, and its legal arrangements. The Byzantines had been the framework. The Ottomans were going to be the new framework, and the Ragusans, with characteristic speed and intelligence, understood this and acted on it before most of the Christian world had finished mourning. The diplomatic mission that Ragusa sent to the Ottoman court in the years immediately following 1453 was one of the most important and least celebrated acts of Ragusan foreign policy. It was important not because it established the relationship, which had been developing informally for decades already, but because it formalized and regularized that relationship in a way that gave it legal standing and institutional durability. The Ahid name that emerged from these negotiations, the formal agreement governing the terms of Ragusan commerce in Ottoman territory, was a legal document of the first importance for the city's subsequent history. Getting this document required skill. The Ottoman court was not particularly interested in the formal legal arrangements that Ragusan merchants wanted. Ottoman legal tradition treated non-Muslims differently from Muslims, and the status of Christian merchants in Ottoman territory was governed by a different framework than the one Ragusan commercial law recognized. Reconciling these two different legal traditions in a way that protected Ragusan merchants without requiring the Ottoman court to abandon its own legal principles required the kind of careful, patient, technically sophisticated negotiation that the Republic's diplomatic tradition was well equipped to conduct. The Ragusans had been studying Byzantine legal practice for centuries and understood the Ottoman inheritance of that practice. They understood how the dhimmi system, the legal framework governing non-Muslim communities in Islamic law, operated in practice, and they understood where within that framework a community like theirs might find the most favorable terms. They also understood how the Ottoman court made decisions, what kinds of arguments resonated, what kinds of gifts were appropriate at what stages of the negotiation, and how to maintain the relationship with the relevant officials while the formal agreement was being worked out. The result was an arrangement that gave Ragusan merchants better commercial access to Ottoman territory than virtually any other group of Christian merchants enjoyed. The annual tribute was a cost, but it was a manageable cost, and the return on it was extraordinary. For more than 2 centuries, Ragusan merchants operated throughout the Ottoman Empire on terms that their Italian competitors could not match, in markets that were growing rapidly as the Ottoman administration stabilized the Balkans and promoted commerce. The specific goods that moved through the Ragusan trading system in the Ottoman period were somewhat different from the goods that had dominated the earlier period of Balkan mining trade. The silver mines of Serbia and Bosnia, which had been the foundation of Ragusan prosperity in the 14th and early 15th centuries, were still producing, but they were now under Ottoman administration, and the arrangements under which Ragusan merchants accessed their output were different from the arrangements of the previous period. The Ottoman period added new commodities to the Ragusan repertoire. Cotton and silk from the Levant and Anatolia moved westward through Ragusan commercial channels. Leather and hides from the pastoral economies of the Balkans and Anatolia moved toward the tanning and leatherworking industries of Italy. Grain from the fertile plains of Thrace and Egypt moved to the grain-short cities of the Adriatic and the Western Mediterranean. And the woolen cloth from Florence and Flanders, that had always been one of the major commodities in the Ragusan system, continued to move eastward into Ottoman markets, where the growing urban populations of Istanbul and the other major Ottoman cities created a substantial demand. The Republic's commercial intelligence about Ottoman market conditions was, as noted earlier, exceptional. But it was exceptional not just because the consular reports were good. though they were, it was exceptional because the city's governing institutions had developed, over generations, the capacity to process and use commercial information in ways that produced better commercial decisions. The senators who sat in the Senate were not just political administrators. They were, or had been, merchants. They had personal experience of the markets they were making decisions about. They could read a report about cotton prices in Beirut or silk prices in Bursa with the understanding that comes from having personally bought and sold these goods. This integration of commercial experience and political authority was one of the distinctive features of the Ragusan governing class, and it produced a quality of decision-making that pure administrative systems in which the politicians and the merchants are separate groups with separate bodies of knowledge, do not easily achieve. The Republic's governing class was small enough and engaged enough in commercial life that the two types of knowledge were present in the same minds, and the resulting decisions benefited from both. The physical geography of the Ottoman commercial empire also shaped the Ragusan commercial strategy in ways that are worth tracing in detail. The Ottoman road network, which was substantially better than the road networks of most other polities in the region, provided the infrastructure through which goods moved. The Ottoman caravanserais, the public inns and warehouses that were provided at regular intervals along the major trade routes, provided the logistical support without which long-distance overland commerce was not viable. And the Ottoman system of weights and measures, standardized across a vast territory, reduced the transaction costs of commerce in ways that less administratively uniform polities could not. Ragusan merchants, who operated in the Ottoman territories, benefited from all of this infrastructure, just as they benefited from the Roman road network in the early period of the city's history. The ability to move goods efficiently through a large, well-administered territory was the foundation of the long-distance commerce that made Ragusa wealthy, and the Ottoman provision of that infrastructure was a genuine commercial asset. The relationship was not without its costs and its complications. The Ottoman system of taxation, while manageable for merchants who understood it, was complex and variable, with different rates and different arrangements applying in different territories and under different circumstances. Navigating this system required the kind of local knowledge and local relationships that only long experience in the Ottoman territories could provide, and Ragusan merchants had that experience and those relationships in ways that newcomers did not. There were also periodic disruptions. Wars between the Ottoman Empire and its various enemies interrupted the trade routes and made the movement of goods dangerous or impossible. Outbreaks of plague in the Ottoman cities disrupted the markets and the commercial relationships. Changes in Ottoman policy, the appointment of a new governor who had different attitudes toward foreign merchants or different fiscal pressures to respond to, could alter the commercial conditions significantly and require rapid adaptation. The Republic's intelligence network was the mechanism through which these disruptions were detected and responded to as rapidly as possible. A war that was going to disrupt the trade routes through Bulgaria could often be anticipated weeks or months in advance if the consul in Sofia was paying attention and reporting reliably. A new governor, whose attitudes toward Ragusan merchants were not yet known, could be assessed through the local contacts that the Ragusan commercial community in his jurisdiction had built over years. The intelligence system was not just about long-term strategy. It was also about the day-to-day operational management of a complex commercial enterprise in a volatile environment. The role of Ragusan women in the city's commercial and civic life is one of the more interesting and more difficult aspects of its history to reconstruct, because the historical record was created primarily by men and reflects primarily male perspectives and male concerns. The formal institutions of the Republic were exclusively male. Women could not sit in the Great Council or the Senate. Women could not hold the office of rector or any other formal public position. Women could not, in the formal legal sense, be full citizens with the political rights that citizenship implied. The Republic, in its formal constitutional arrangements, was a male institution governing a community in which women's public presence was largely ceremonial or confined to the informal networks of family and neighborhood that operated below the level of formal governance. But women were present in the commercial life of the city, in ways that the formal record does not fully capture. They inherited commercial interests. They managed businesses on behalf of husbands who were away on trading voyages that might last years. They ran the household economies of noble and merchant families in ways that required considerable financial sophistication, and they were present in the informal networks through which information moved and relationships were maintained, networks that were in some respects as important as the formal institutions. The archives contain documents in which women appear as parties to commercial transactions, as inheritors of trading businesses, as managers of property. These documents tell only part of the story, but they suggest that the effective commercial role of women in the Ragusan commercial system was considerably greater than their formal, legal, and political exclusion would suggest. The religious life of Ragusan women was also an important dimension of the city's social fabric. The convents of Ragusa, where women of noble and sometimes non-noble families lived under religious vows, were significant institutions in the city's social and economic life. They owned property, which they managed. They produced goods, including the fine needlework for which several of the city's convents were known. They provided education for the daughters of the noble families, and they served as retirement institutions for widows and unmarried women who had no other suitable place in a society that organized itself primarily around family units. The quality of life in the convents varied, as it varied in convents everywhere. Some were comfortable and intellectually stimulating, with access to books and correspondence and the intellectual life of the city. Others were more constrained, but they were also, for many women, a form of freedom from the arrangements that the marriage market imposed on noble women who were expected to marry whom their families chose, and to manage the domestic and reproductive dimensions of those marriages with the resources that their families provided. The story of Ragusan women is a story that historians are still recovering, piecing together from the partial record that the archives preserve. And it is a story that, when it is finally fully told, will add dimensions to our understanding of the Republic that the formal institutional history cannot provide. The islands of the Ragusan territory were another dimension of the Republic's identity and its economic life that deserves attention. The Republic controlled not just the city on the mainland, but a scatter of islands in the southern Adriatic, most notably the Elefiti Islands to the northwest and the island of Lastovo, known in Italian as Lagosta, further out to sea. These islands were not just appendages of the mainland city. They were communities with their own histories and their own identities, their own agricultural economies and their own maritime traditions. The men of the islands were sailors and fishermen, and their contribution to the Ragusan merchant fleet was substantial. The agricultural products of the islands, wine and olive oil and figs, and the other Mediterranean staples, supplemented the city's food supply, and the islands provided strategic depth, points of refuge and resupply that could be useful when the mainland city was under threat. The Republic administered the islands through governors who were appointed by the Senate and who served terms of office similar to the mainland officials, with the rotation provisions that were a feature of all Ragusan administration. The islands had their own legal arrangements and their own local customs, but they operated within the overall framework of the Republic's law and the Republic's commercial system. The relationship between the island communities and the city was one of the lesser studied aspects of Ragusan's social history, but it was important. The islanders were distinct from the mainlanders in ways that they were aware of and sometimes insisted on. Their maritime traditions were their own. Their local customs had developed independently, and their relationship to the governing nobility of the city was mediated by the geographical distance and the practical autonomy that island life produced. The fishermen and sailors of the Elefiti Islands had a directness and a self-reliance that the more urbanized inhabitants of the city sometimes found disconcerting. They were not deferential in the way that the formal hierarchy of the Republic expected subordinate communities to be. They knew the sea in a way that even experienced Ragusan mariners respected, and they were, in the difficult periods, the most reliable source of the fresh food and the logistical support that the city needed when its normal supply chains were disrupted. The islands also contributed to the defensive system of the Republic in ways that are easy to overlook. Control of the islands meant control of the approaches to the harbour from the open sea, A hostile fleet approaching Ragusa from the south or southwest had to pass through or around the island chain, and the watchtowers that the Republic maintained on the higher points of the islands gave warning of approaching threats that allowed the harbour defences to be prepared. The islands were, in this sense, part of the same system of careful attention and early warning that characterized the Republic's approach to security in all its dimensions. The financial architecture of the Republic of Ragusa was sophisticated in ways that reflect the city's deep integration into the broader commercial and financial world of the late medieval and early modern Mediterranean. The city maintained a public treasury that was managed according to principles of fiscal conservatism that were unusual for the period. The Republic did not borrow beyond its means. It maintained reserves against contingencies. It paid its debts. These principles were not just ethical commitments. They were practical necessities for a city whose commercial standing depended on its creditworthiness, and they were enforced by institutional mechanisms that made sustained fiscal irresponsibility difficult. The taxation system that funded the public treasury was organized around the customs duties that the city collected on goods moving through its port. These duties were the primary source of public revenue, supplementing the tribute payments that the Republic received from the territories it controlled and the fees it charged for various commercial and legal services. The customs duties were calibrated to be substantial enough to fund the city's needs without being high enough to divert traffic to competing ports. Finding this balance required constant attention to the competitive situation, and the Senate periodically reviewed and adjusted the rates in response to changes in the commercial environment. Private finance in Ragusa was organized around the system of commercial partnerships that were the standard instrument of medieval Mediterranean commerce. These partnerships, called commenda in the Italian commercial tradition that Ragusa drew on, allowed a merchant with capital to invest it in a voyage without personally conducting the voyage, and allowed a merchant with skills but without capital to conduct a voyage using invested capital without having to provide the money himself. The arrangements were defined by contract, specified the terms of the profit sharing between the investing partner and the active partner, and were enforceable through the city's courts. The commenda system was one of the foundational instruments of the commercial capitalism that was developing in the Mediterranean world in this period, and Ragusa was fully integrated into it. The commercial contracts in the city's archives show the full range of arrangements that Ragusan merchants used, from simple two-party partnerships to more complex multilateral arrangements that spread the risk and the capital across multiple investors. The system of commercial credit that supported these partnerships was centered in the Italian banking houses of Florence and Venice and Genoa, which provided the financial infrastructure for long-distance commerce across the Mediterranean world. Ragusan merchants had accounts with these houses and used their instruments of credit, the bills of exchange that allowed value to be transferred across long distances without physically moving coins, to settle their international transactions. The integration into the Italian financial system gave Ragusan commerce a financial sophistication that might not have been achievable from the city's own resources alone. But the Ragusans were not just passive users of Italian financial services. They were themselves lenders and investors, providing capital to merchants from other cities and receiving the returns on those investments. The wealthier Ragusan noble families maintained significant capital reserves deployed across multiple instruments and multiple markets that gave them both financial security and financial leverage. The management of these reserves required the kind of financial sophistication that the city's educational and commercial traditions had developed over generations. The art and architecture of Ragusa across its centuries of existence reflects the same combination of influences and practical intelligence that characterized its governance and its commerce. The city was not an artistic innovator in the way that Florence or Venice were innovators. It was an excellent adapter, taking the architectural and artistic traditions of the wider Mediterranean world and applying them with skill and care to the specific conditions of its own landscape and its own needs. The great churches and civic buildings of the city reflect the successive waves of influence that washed over it from the broader European world. The Romanesque Gothic blend of the Franciscan monastery's cloister reflects the influence of the Italian architectural tradition as it reached the Adriatic in the 13th and 14th centuries. The later churches and the rebuilt civic buildings of the post-earthquake period reflect the Baroque that had become the dominant architectural language of Catholic Europe in the 17th century. The walls themselves, which were continuously built and rebuilt and reinforced across centuries, reflect the evolving technology of military architecture as the threats the city faced evolved from siege warfare to artillery bombardment. The city's domestic architecture, the houses that lined the streets running north and south from the Stradon, showed a similar pragmatic adaptation of available models to local conditions. The standard Ragusan house type, with its ground floor workshop or shop, its upper residential floors, and its small internal courtyard, was a functional response to the constraints of a dense urban environment in a warm climate. The stone was limestone, because limestone was what the landscape provided in abundance. The construction was solid and durable, because in a city that sat in an earthquake zone, solid and durable was what survival required. The artistic life of the city, beyond architecture, included painting and sculpture of genuine quality, though the surviving examples were significantly reduced by the earthquake and the fires that followed. The Ragusan tradition of goldsmithy and silversmithing produced objects that were traded across the Mediterranean world and that survive in collections across Europe and in the treasury of the cathedral in Dubrovnik. The textile arts, the embroidery, and the weaving that the city's craftswomen produced were known across the Adriatic trading world for their quality. And the literary tradition, the poetry and drama and chronicle writing that the Republic supported through its educational institutions and its cultural patronage, was the most distinctive cultural achievement of the city's long history. Ivan Gundulic, whose great poem Osman stands as the most ambitious literary achievement of the Ragusan tradition, was in many ways the perfect expression of the culture that the Republic had created. He was a nobleman, a member of one of the great governing families, who had served in the public positions that the Republic required of its noble class. He was educated in the Latin tradition, deeply familiar with the classical heritage that was the common property of the European literary world, and he chose to write not in Latin, the prestige language of educated Europe, but in Croatian, the vernacular language of the people he lived among. The choice to write in Croatian rather than Latin was a political, as much as an aesthetic decision. It was a statement about the value of the vernacular tradition, about the worthiness of the language that the people of the city and the surrounding region spoke in their daily lives. And it was, in a subtle way, a statement about identity, about the relationship between the Latin administrative tradition that the Republic had inherited and the South Slavic cultural tradition that was the living heritage of the majority of its inhabitants. Osman itself, completed in the 1620s, is a poem about the Ottoman-Polish War of 1621, written from a perspective that is at once sympathetic to the Ottoman world, which Ragusa knew intimately, and celebratory of the Christian victory that the Polish king achieved. It is a work that could only have been written in Ragusa, in a city that stood at the intersection of these worlds, and that had the experience and the institutional confidence to look at both with the measured intelligence that was the city's defining characteristic. There is a particular quality of evening light in Dubrovnik that travelers have been remarking on for centuries, a quality that comes from the combination of the limestone and the sea, and the specific angle at which the Adriatic light hits the coast in the hours before sunset. The limestone of the city walls and the paving of the streets catches the light in a way that makes the whole city seem to glow from within, a warm amber that intensifies as the sun descends and then fades quickly into the particular deep blue of the southern Adriatic sky. People who have experienced this light and then tried to describe it almost always fail, not because they lack the words, but because the experience has a quality that is more than visual, more than aesthetic. It is the experience of a place that has accumulated over many centuries a density of human attention and human intention that is palpable to anyone who is paying attention. The light does not explain this density, but it makes it visible. The walls were built by people who understood that survival required effort, and that the effort was worth making. The streets were laid by people who understood that a city is a shared project, that the decisions of one generation shape the possibilities of the next. The archives were maintained by people who understood that knowledge is a form of capital, that the accumulated experience of one era is the foundation of wisdom in the next. The institutions were designed by people who understood that human nature is neither perfectly good nor perfectly bad, and that the task of governance is to create structures that make the good more likely to express itself and the bad more likely to be contained. All of this intention and all of this understanding is in the stone, if you know how to read it. The thickness of the walls speaks the understanding of people who knew they were vulnerable and who decided that building well was the appropriate response to vulnerability. The precision of the legal documents in the archives speaks the understanding of people who knew that the world was full of parties who would not behave in good faith unless the agreement was too precisely specified to allow bad faith. The rotating rectorship speaks the understanding of people who knew that power corrupts and that the appropriate response to that knowledge is structural rather than simply aspirational. These are the lessons of Ragusa. Not the romantic lessons, not the lessons about heroic resistance or the triumph of the underdog, though those elements are present in the story. The deeper lessons are about the relationship between intelligence and survival, between institutional design and human flourishing, between the long view and the capacity to remain free in a world full of entities that would prefer you not to be. The lights of the city come on as the evening deepens, visible from the sea as points of warm gold against the darkening limestone. The harbour lit and the Stradon lit, and the bars and restaurants of the old city drawing the evening visitors who come every year in their millions to walk the streets that the senators and the merchants and the sailors and the priests walked for centuries before them. The city endures. The walls are standing. The sea is the colour that painters argue over and can never quite capture, and somewhere in the accumulated silence of this place, in the warm stone and the quiet water and the long memory that places accumulate when they have been inhabited long enough, the Republic still exists. Not as an institution, not as a government, but as an argument that small communities, given good institutions, can accomplish extraordinary things. Rest well tonight.